let's do it. So welcome Matt and welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I enjoy everyone's conversation and friendships, both atheists and theists and others. I'm hoping to have a constructive and polite debate tonight to ask one another for clarification so that we're responding to one another's actual claims. And I hope you will reciprocate that, Matt. So first, the topic might sound a little strange to atheists. Is atheism the proper worldview? And I'll just say I accepted under Matt's wording of the question because that was the topic he offered. So let me clarify terms. What might we mean by atheistic worldview? Well, to someone like Matt, who sees an atheist like me offer many positions on science and ethics, he might misclassify all of these beliefs under an umbrella atheist worldview. But of course, for me, atheism is just a component of my worldview, not the overarching umbrella framework. So what I can do is provide a worldview that an atheist might have, or an atheist's worldview. So take a worldview, at least, consisting of these three things: metaphysics, an epistemology, and an ethics. So my worldview is roughly naturalism, as opposed to supernaturalism, and thus no-God beliefs. Evidentialism, rationalism, as opposed to faith or scripture, and humanism in terms of ethics. So this is an atheist worldview, and the one I'll be promoting tonight. Now, what makes a claim or a worldview proper or appropriate or better? And I would say two things. One would be truth. I should hold a claim or worldview if it's true, or at least admitting to be true. And second, goodness. If a worldview or belief is pragmatic, has good results, causes individuals or societies to act in a morally desirable way, I should hold to that. So my atheistic worldview is proper or superior for both of these reasons. It's both true and morally superior. So first, my atheistic worldview is superior in terms of truth. My evidential methods are more accurate and therefore get us closer to the truth. They're based on intellectual honesty, skepticism, empirical evidence, logic, and testing one's claims and then accepting the results of those tests. In contrast, theistic worldviews are inferior and farther from the truth because they're based on weak evidence, methods like faith, miracle claims, dreams, vague prophecies. This is evidence that can be easily explained away, and often evidence that equally supports competing religious claims. If religious reasoning methods lead people to reach opposing, contradictory conclusions, for example, the inerrancy of the Bible versus inerrancy of the Quran, they're clearly not reliable methods. In addition, theistic worldviews are based on weak rational arguments, such as the cosmological, teleological, moral, etc. All such arguments can be easily undermined or refuted, and I'm happy to do so. Furthermore, my atheistic worldview is superior in terms of truth because it's better able to explain the world we live in. While theism is full of logical and moral contradictions, atheism does not suffer from these. Not only can my worldview readily explain the known facts of science, it can also explain away all of the religious phenomena, namely through the superior hypothesis that man made gods. This hypothesis powerfully explains the culturally specific nature of gods, scriptures, miracles, prophets, wish fulfillment with an afterlife, and the observation that gods are made in the image of men. Through my worldview, we have compelling neurophysiological, biological, as per evolutionary psychology, and sociological explanations for how all these false religious beliefs and subsequent religious social structures will emerge. Second point, my atheistic worldview is morally superior. It's superior first because it's actually about morality, about ensuring flourishing for sentient life. Matt's ethics are not about morality, they are about obedience, often to capricious and unjust laws that punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty. My ethical system evolves and improves, while religious ethics are largely stuck in the Iron Age. Centuries of learning from human civilization, history, literature, psychology, biology, and moral philosophy have informed a better world with better ethics. A world where religious indoctrination, apathy towards animals, fear-mongering, sexism, homophobia, and religious exclusivism have no place. This ethical growth is critical because ethics, like science, need to evolve as we learn more about the world and one another. Finally, my ethical system is better for the poor, for women, for LGBT persons, for international development, for interfaith cooperation, for education, and therefore for everyone. Most religious states and countries have a higher rate of social dysfunction. That is to say, non-religious states have better healthcare, education, economic well-being, happiness, and equality, lower rates of teen pregnancy, divorce, STDs, rape, murder, and other forms of crime. And this holds true both domestically across states and internationally across countries. So rank the best to worst places to live in order, and it's almost, but not exactly, a list of the least religious to most religious countries. That is, the Human Development Index inversely correlates with religiosity. This is a powerful reason to think that my atheistic worldview is not just true and intellectually honest, but the preferable one to hold for both moral and pragmatic reasons. And with that, I will hand the mic over to you, Matt. Go ahead, Matt.
Just collecting my notes. A worldview. You went very, very quickly. I tried to write down what it is you were saying so I can respond to what you said. You said that atheism is a component of his worldview. Well, that's not what the debate is about. The debate is presupposing that atheism itself is a worldview. That is what the topic is. Is atheism the proper worldview to affirm or to have? You are arguing that point, not that atheism is a subset of a larger worldview. So you need to stay on topic, the topic that we agreed on. And you define goodness as being pragmatic. Moral and immorality is not something that we would desire. You defined goodness as being something that is basically utilitarian and pragmatic. But the problem with this is all you're doing is just assigning a certain value arbitrarily to something that you want in your worldview, in your atheism. But you don't have any intellectual or moral justification to say that such a thing is valid. You certainly have the right for your opinion, but you do not have the right to assert that your opinion is the right one to hold. You say that atheism is a true and morally superior system? Really? And how do you define and develop and ascertain absolute moral norms by which you can judge whether or not some other particular action is morally right or wrong? In atheism, there are no universal conventions. There are adaptations, as you yourself said. Society is evolving. Well, that means one moral today could be another man's moral tomorrow, or stop being morally true. You can't say that it's morally better without begging the question, which is a logical fallacy. If you say that things are getting better because atheism is learning about things, that's how come we're morally evolving, you're not saying anything. All you're saying is that it's getting better because you define it as getting better. That's not an argument. It's an assertion. And you're not developing any rational basis for the assertion other than begging the question out of your atheism. You're not establishing that atheism is the proper worldview to hold. A worldview deals with issues of morality, our existence, and other things. And you mentioned the idea of the cosmological argument, which you said could be refuted. Maybe we could debate that sometime. Saying it doesn't make it so. But I'm here hoping that you can establish that atheism actually is the proper worldview to hold, because it'd be proper if it can properly understand morality, properly understand our own existence, properly be able to account for, just say morality and our existence for now, and even rationality, which it can't do. But you see, if you say that atheism can explain all religious experiences, you're not saying atheism, you're saying that the scientific method that looks into the brain can then determine certain functions that occur in the brain or religious experiences. That's not atheism. That's a function of the brain. So you're misapplying what atheism is and the issue of brain function. Unless you, as you said, you assume naturalism, and I didn't get the other thing that you said you assumed as being true, but you're just making the assumption that naturalism is all that there is. You're not validating that it is. You're just assuming it. It just doesn't make any sense. You just say, I assume this position, naturalism, and atheism is true because naturalism is true. You have a tautologist argument. You're arguing in circles. Now, you said your atheistic moral worldview is superior. Mass ethics are not really about obedience. I didn't quite get what you said there. I probably just misquoted you. My apologies for that. You were going very, very quickly. You said your ethical system evolves and improves, where mine is stuck in the Iron Age. That's just not a good argument. To say that something evolves doesn't mean it's improving, particularly in a moral issue. And just because something is old does not mean it's not valid or true. Genetic fallacy. You're committing all sorts of logical errors here. You mentioned biology and moral philosophy and a better work. I didn't quite get what that was. Sorry. Homophobia. Sexism have no place. Well, see, you're just defining homophobia a certain way, sexism a certain way, LGBT. You're raising this as moral issues that ought to be developed, or these things are right in themselves. Again, all you're doing is presupposing certain things. You're working through these arguments. You're assuming the necessity and validity of pragmatism. You're assuming the necessity and validity of naturalism. You are assuming that homosexual behavior, sexism, whatever it is, all these sexual things, these various things are simply not good or not bad or whatever they are. You're just making assumptions. Now, as an atheist, you have the right to make assumptions. Thank you for the 1 minute left. You have a right to make an assumption. No problem. I defend your right for that. You cannot justify, however, that your personal opinions about what are supposed to be right and wrong, as everybody else is supposed to be subject to, is the right one to hold to. Your atheism is simply a denial of God. Is your denial of God the right thing to do? Is it the right thing to do? You've not established that your denial of God is the right thing to do. Is it the proper position to hold, the denial of God? You've not been able to, in your atheistic perspective, establish any cogent reason why we can have objective morals, nor can you account for our existence, nor can you justify your naturalism, which ultimately, I can talk about later, is self-refuting. Because your naturalism does not allow you to have the free will choice to make these choices. Not get into that. Time's up. Go for it. Oh, sorry, my mic's up. So my bad. Sorry about that.
No worries, Matt. So I'll take some of your points in reverse order. So first, atheism, as I define it, is lack of belief in gods, plural. I would encourage you to not think in a false dichotomy. It's not just Yahweh or no Yahweh. There are many forms and interpretations of gods, and polytheism, monotheism, pantheism, panentheism, etc. So I don't just respond to Abrahamic monotheism. Second, when I say ethics improve, and that's why my ethics are better than yours, in part, one of the reasons why, it's not a genetic fallacy. I didn't say that your ethics are bad just because they're older. I provided a justification, namely that your older ethics are based on less evidence. I have the benefit of thousands of years of civilization, history, biology, culture, and moral philosophy that your ethical system doesn't have, so it's not a genetic fallacy. The argument was included. Now, one of your major points was that I sort of presupposed and assumed a lot of things, and that's sort of an odd thing to say. Obviously, in an introduction to a debate, I'm outlining my ideas rather than demonstrating all of them. So I didn't prove naturalism and humanism and rationalism and empiricism in 5 minutes. I outlined those ideas, and we can get into any of them. Moreover, one of the points I made was that my epistemology is based on better and more honest evidential methods, which I went into in some depth, and I demonstrated how they are better than the methods that you provide, and thus giving us truer results, and related to this, giving us better results in terms of morality, and better and stronger and more robust and reliable moral ideas. So how do I define moral norms? Well, I define moral norms based on the best evidence that we have, rather than using ancient scriptural evidence. So there is an intellectual and a moral justification, and we can certainly get into the particular claims I made about how my methods are better, my arguments are going to be stronger, and my moral system actually has to do with morality rather than obedience. And of course, we can disagree. I mean, you think that a moral system that's better for LGBT persons is probably worse. And so we're going to beg the question against each other here. But again, the Human Development Index inversely correlates with religiosity. The most religious countries have the worst everything, worst healthcare, worst education, most crime. So is it really a proper worldview to hold a worldview which leads countries to have, or is at least correlated with countries having all these bad characteristics? No, I don't think so. So when I offer an atheistic worldview, certainly we can discuss what that is, but since you demanded this topic, I think it's only fair that I have at least some leeway in defining what an atheistic worldview is, since you well know that lack of belief in gods does not constitute a full ontological, epistemological, and moral system. Mike is yours.
Well, lack of belief in God is your position, but a lack of belief is not a position. It's just nothing. You argue from what you believe, not what you don't believe. And I'm not arguing for anything except the Christian concept of God, but the debate is not about the Christian concept of God. It's about your atheism. Is atheism, your particular brand, your lack of belief in God, is the proper one to have? You say you have something about my older ethics are based on less evidence. Well, that's really interesting. Can you give me a listing, say 3 things, of what constitutes evidence for ethics? I'd like to know three things that constitute evidence for ethical value. Okay, that'd be interesting because you're playing. So you said this before that we have the evidence for ethics. Really? I'm curious to know what that is. Where's your evidence? Under rocks? What? What is it? I really want to know. Now, you presuppose naturalism, which you cannot validate as being true, but your naturalism is self-refuting. Naturalism, ladies and gentlemen, is simply the position that the natural world is all there is. That means that the physical brain must operate under the laws of physics, chemistry, motion, etc., electrical currents. The question, and it's a huge problem in the naturalistic worldview, is how does such a condition produce proper logical inference in a physical brain? If you have one chemical state that leaves another chemical state, you cannot validate that there is any logical proper inference being produced. Naturalism necessarily is self-refuting because what it does is it takes away the issue of free will, takes the issue away of true rationality and proper logical discourse away from that position, and means ultimately that it's self-refuting because you cannot justify proper logical inference from a naturalistic worldview when you look at the physical brain as being a mere component of physical parts. It just doesn't work. So your proposition that naturalism is part of your worldview means that your worldview can't work. It's invalidated simply by your assumption, which you have not been able to validate as being true. That's the onus is on you. You see, more honest methods. You know, this is really interesting because you talk about which method has more honesty in it. Well, that's a subjective experience. That's a subjective thing. Who's more honest? Well, that's an intention of the heart. You're going to read the people's hearts now to know what's going on? This isn't making any sense. You talk about moral norms based on the best evidence. Give me some of that best evidence. I want to see the evidence that you're going to demonstrate proves that your moral system is based on evidence. I'm really curious to know what that is. Go ahead.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, again, in reverse order. So, under naturalism, if determinism were true, not necessarily, brains deterministically would produce a concrete result. And you say that it doesn't work and somehow evolution and without free will we can't have rational thoughts. I don't even know how that argument's supposed to work. But if naturalism holds, we're both speaking and understanding one another, and we're using computers that work. So I don't see what about naturalism is self-defeating here. I don't think you've made that point. Moreover, I don't have to presuppose naturalism. You have to demonstrate supernaturalism, because supernaturalism introduces additional items to our ontology. Ceteris paribus, that's all things being equal. The larger the ontology, the more justification is needed. And the items introduced to your ontology are large and complex. Ceteris paribus, large and complex additions to ontology require additional justification. We default to simpler ontologies, not invisible, immaterial things. So you do have the burden of proof on supernaturalism. You also wanted three pieces of evidence for ethics that we've learned in the past, say, 1800, 2000 years. Well, one, we've determined that skin color isn't a determinant of moral character or quality. So slavery isn't an appropriate thing. We've learned that as well, despite thousands of years of religion supporting and propping up slavery before finally overturning it. And of course, being in scripture, we learn that slavery isn't wrong. This is a result of civilization and psychology and learning about ethics. Moreover, we've learned that, for example, sociopathy or psychopathy are the result of neurophysiological impairment. So literally, damage to one's ventromedial frontal cortex and amygdala will make someone have sociopathic tendencies. This is learnings from neuroscience. So there are a lot of things we can learn about morality. Finally, you're right. Lack of belief in gods is not in itself a worldview, which is why it was bizarre to only offer a topic that you knew was a misnomer. So because it's not a worldview, I defined my atheistic worldview as a worldview that includes aspects necessary to actually constitute a worldview, namely a metaphysical or ontological position, an epistemological position, and an ethical position. So if you wanted to actually debate a worldview, I'm going to provide you a worldview, and I think that's only fair. So I would like you to demonstrate why supernaturalism holds, and why naturalism doesn't allow rational thought, or however that argument's supposed to run. Because I've never heard a compelling presentation of it. And the microphone is yours.
The debate is not about my supernaturalism naturalism or any position I might hold to that. It's not part of the debate. The debate title is atheism the proper worldview to hold? And we'll stick to the debate topic that we agreed on. You want me to demonstrate that naturalism doesn't work? Of course. The human brain is indeed a sophisticated machine. But if it is restricted to the physical laws, then it will automatically respond in a predictable way based upon brain wiring and stimulus. This would mean that given the exact same circumstances, the exact same responses would always occur. This negates free will, since every time the exact same circumstances arise, the exact same response will occur. This is the necessity of naturalism. This would mean that the atheist has no real freedom of will and has no reason to trust his thoughts about reality, about God, about himself, his others, experiences, or his rational conclusions. Therefore, your naturalism is self-refuting because it cannot rationally defend its own position. It does not provide intellectual preconditions for intelligibility. Your atheism, your naturalism, could never be known to be right or wrong because it's just a function of your brain. You would not be able to know if your brain was right or wrong. This is an important point. What it does is it falsifies your atheism. It means that your position here, that you're arguing that atheism is a proper worldview, from your perspective, when you say naturalism, you could never know that your naturalism was correct, because all your brain's doing is reacting to stimulus and producing a necessary response per the laws of physics and chemistry and chemical wiring. There's no way for you to defend that you have proper logical inference as a product of your naturalistic restrictions upon a physical brain. This is devastating to your argument. You need to understand this argument. And you need to really focus on this, because it does mean that your position is not correct. It can't be correct. You cannot philosophically defend your position from that naturalistic foundation. Now again, I do not have to demonstrate supernaturalism. You have to demonstrate the topic, that atheism is a proper worldview. You are obligated to demonstrate that it is a proper position. And therefore you are the one obligated to demonstrate supernaturalism is not true. You see, if I happen to be a supernaturalist, which we haven't defined, and you're going to hold the affirmative position that atheism is the right way to go, then you have to demonstrate. You have to. The burden of proof is on you. That my supernaturalism is not correct. Well, I've already given you an argument why your naturalism can't work. I'm using what you say. I'm going off of what you say. Your naturalism is self-refuting. It does not work, and it cannot work. So, that's that. I'm off. You're on.
Thanks, Matt. So your argument again that naturalism negates free will. First, it almost struck me as an argument from emotional appeal. Oh, I'm afraid of not having free will, so I don't like atheism. Obviously, an appeal to consequences or appeal to emotions is irrelevant here. So I hope you're not trying to do that. Now, why would a concrete, determined method not work? Why would it keep us from trusting results? It strikes me that concrete, deterministic functions do work. So, for example, we have an equation in physics. We calculate the motion of a projectile. We plug in the values to the equation. We get a result. It works. What is it about a function that doesn't work? It works in physics. It works in chemistry. Why would it not work in brain physics? So I don't understand where your argument's even coming from off the ground. Because it seems quite on the contrary that your supernaturalism invokes a sort of randomness. If it's not based on deterministic causes that work with physical functions that have predictable results, then we have some sort of supernatural randomness. And that supernatural randomness seems to me that it would undermine trustworthiness. It would undermine legitimacy. It would undermine standardization. So again, I don't see what's wrong with the function of the brain, and we can see that naturalism is correct if it holds, because the computer is working right now, and the computer is using physics. Now, supernaturalism is part of the debate because you're making assertions about naturalism not working. So clearly you have an alternative. And if truth can't work under my worldview, it must work under your worldview. And this is already problematic because, as I began with, your evidential methods aren't reliable. Your evidential methods are faith, which is completely unreliable. It's just wishful thinking. Miracle claims, dreams, prophecies, strong feelings. And these same poor methods can be used to support Mormonism and Islam and Hinduism and Zoroastrianism. Methods that lead to competing and opposing and mutually exclusive results are not reliable methods. So you have not demonstrated that you have anything approaching a reliable method, and I don't think you at all made a case that deterministic functions, which work well in physics and work well in chemistry, somehow wouldn't work well with human brains. So with that, I'll leave the microphone to you.
To say naturalism negates free will is not an argument of emotional appeal. You made a mistake there. You've made several logic errors here. When I say that naturalism negates free will, the physical brain is a set of complex structures, neurochemical wiring. How does one chemical state that leads to another chemical state in the brain produce proper logical inference? That's the question. It's not saying that you guys as atheists cannot solve an equation. That's not the issue. The issue is your worldview of naturalism is self-refuting. Your position, of naturalism is self-refuting because naturalism says that the physical brain is nothing more than a sophisticated mechanism restricted to the laws of physics. How does one chemical state, what has one neurochemical state that leads to another neurochemical state produce proper logical inference? That's the question. You cannot demonstrate any way that such a position can produce proper logical inference. It's not to say that you can't use logic. That's not the question. It's how does it produce proper logical inference? You stand on that foundation, but you don't know where the foundation comes from, and you can't justify that foundation. That's the issue. I've said this before. It's about the third time I'm repeating this. I don't think you're getting it. If you don't understand the argument, then you really are in a deficit at this point. I would suggest that you could study it if you want. But supernaturalism does not necessarily undermine the regularity of the universe, particularly the Christian view, which we haven't gotten into, but it presupposes the necessity of regularity. But that's a whole other thing. You say my evidential methods are faith, dreams, claims, dreams, prophecies. Really? How do you know? You don't know what my methodologies are for determining truth. You don't know. You say they're poor methods, but you have not even asked me what my methodology is for determining truth. And so what you're doing here is assigning a value to me you've not verified as being true. You've been doing this several times already this evening. It's a problem. I don't think that you really should make claims and speak for me. I think you should ask me what my position is. But nevertheless, the debate is on the validity of atheism as a worldview, the one that we ought to have. The proper one is something we ought to have. We're getting into the moral issue of this as well. And you can't, again, are not able to demonstrate a proper moral standard by which you, from your atheistic perspective, can assert is right one for everybody to hold. Otherwise, it's not right. Now, your naturalism and your scientific method associated with it necessarily precludes the option of God's existence. Now think about it. What naturalism does is it defines only the natural world. If God exists, he exists outside of it. So when you appeal to naturalism and the scientific method, you're automatically defining God out of the equation. And then you get a result that gets exactly what you're looking for. So in other words, what you've done is you've hamstrung yourself from the beginning. Your presuppositions are at fault. Go ahead.
So, thank you, Matt. I hope you stay constructive here. You don't need to get too much into the insults. So first, I'm not defining your God away as an assumption. I'm not assuming naturalism. Naturalism is a null position because supernaturalism hasn't been demonstrated. That's why naturalism remains the null position. So it's not a necessary assumption or a dogmatic assumption like faith claims, for example. In terms of demonstrating a proper moral standard, again, I'm using the best evidence we have available. I have meta-ethical positions, normative ethical positions, applied ethical positions. We can talk about those if you want to. As for not knowing what your methodologies are, well, first, methodologies are not that varied, or not massively varied within theism, right? I've heard you talk before. On your website, you speak a lot about faith. You speak a lot about scripture. So when I talk about faith in scripture and revelation, it's not coming from nowhere. So I don't think that was a fair point of view to make. And then getting back to this main argument that you jabbed me over, that somehow under determinism, defined and determined functions don't lead to reliable results. I think this is just bizarre. How do chemicals lead to logical inference? Well, logical inference follows from set theory. A smaller set is within a larger set, right? It's pretty straightforward. How does a calculator work without free will? How does a calculator do functions without free will? Clearly it does, right? Clearly your Macintosh doesn't have free will. So we don't need supernatural free will powers to have reliable results. So again, I don't think that argument you made even gets off its face. And it may be my mistake that was an emotional appeal. It seemed like it was. So I'm glad you're not trying to appeal to consequences. So we can talk a little bit about your methodologies and why you think supernaturalism holds here and is important, and or why you think that ethics follow better from supernaturalism than naturalism. So I'd like to hear your responses to either of those, or you could explain to me how supernatural randomness leads to reliability, whereas neurochemical structures and defined physical functions, as say used by a calculator or computer, are unreliable. Or do you think they're unreliable? Do you think calculators are unreliable because they don't have free will? Mike is yours.
I did not insult you. I do not believe I did. If I did, it was not intentional. My apologies, but I was just addressing the issues. I have not made any assertion about my supernaturalism. Again, you have made the assertion about atheism, that it is the proper position to hold. Therefore, it's up to you to demonstrate that atheism is the right position. You've not done that. You said I speak about faith in Scripture. Well, that's in the context of talking to Christians and people who hold to theistic views, and then I will argue in that. That's not the context here. The context here is outside of that. It's in the validity of your atheism. Your naturalism and your scientific method are associated with it and are necessary preconditions that opt out God. You define God out of existence, and you've not demonstrated that such a definition is therefore true. What you've done is you've assumed the position of naturalism, which is the position that the universe is all that there is. The natural physical realm is all there is. You can't validate that in the scientific method. You presuppose it. And by presupposing such a thing, you're saying we cannot accept God. He does not exist because we're not defining him within the realm of possibility. We're assuming naturalism. But you can't demonstrate that that's true. You have to assume it. Now, you asked, how do chemicals lead to logical inference? You said it works on set theory. In order for you to have set theory, you have to have the presupposition that logical inference occurs. That's not a question that logical inference is necessary for set theory. We're talking about how does a physical brain, that where one chemical state exists, leads to another chemical state, produces proper logical inference. If I have two chemicals on a table, and I mix them in a third container, does that produce logic? If I have 50 chemicals and put some wires between them, does that produce logic? Well, how far up the complexity scale do we go before it produces proper logic? That's the brain. Nobody has an answer for this in a naturalistic worldview. It just doesn't work. Your position is self-refuting. Your atheism cannot stand on this. You cannot stand on naturalism as a proper way of determining free will. Now, when you said, well, Matt, can't we have a calculator or a computer work without having to have free will? Of course, but they're not sentient. They're not chemical reactions. They're not human beings. They're different things, different categories. So you've made a category mistake in this. Another logic error on your part. Now, we don't need supernatural free will powers to have logical inference. Well, you don't know that. That's another assertion that you've made. You said that you're glad I was not appealing to... Oh, yeah. You said that you were glad I was not appealing to the consequences for the justification of something. Yeah, that's exactly what you were doing earlier when you appealed to pragmatism and the issue of morality. So you're self-refuting here. Now, how does supernatural randomness leads to reliability? I'm reading my notes. Where's neurochemical structure says, I don't have my notes don't make sense. At this point, just going as fast as I can. And so far, you failed in your ability to explain the naturalistic problem, which is an undergirding principle in your atheism. It can't work. And you've not demonstrated that your atheism is a proper moral position to hold. You've actually contradicted yourself in that, in the pragmatism issue. You're Mike.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So, if you assert that naturalism can provide reliability, you must have some way of demonstrating that supernatural randomness of some sort does provide reliability. Now, we talk with a calculator or chemicals. Two chemicals produce a third chemical, and we can measure that third chemical. Well, we understand how a calculator works, and it produces reliable results under naturalism. So it doesn't seem supernaturalism is required. And you're right that a calculator may be different from a human being. But how exactly does sentience if my calculator were to become sentient, would it cease to function? Would the equations cease to work, barring supernatural intervention? So again, you can criticize me for not understanding your argument. I don't see it as valid at all. I don't see how concrete deterministic functions don't produce real results. It seems to me that you're just sort of incredulous that simple chemicals could have complex results. But again, we know that calculators work, we know that computers work, and there are good reasons to think that naturalistic functions produce reliable results. Now, part of this debate, and the whole purpose of you picking this topic and only allowing this topic, is because you wanted to keep me on the defensive the whole time because that's where I think you're comfortable. And the issue is, of course, that you do have the burden of proof. You absolutely have the burden of proof. And I'm going to go through a list of reasons why. First, supernaturalism introduces additional items into our ontology. All things being equal, the larger the ontology, the more justification. We default to smaller ontologies. You add in supernatural worlds and dimensions and souls and deities, you have more things, more burden of proof. Your ontology is large and complex. Large and complex additions require additional justification. We default to simple ontologies. I believe in simple physics. You believe in all-powerful abstract things. So again, burden of proof is on your side. Your supernaturalism introduces new classes of items. Supernatural, what does that mean? Immaterial, what does that mean? Unobservable things that we were supposed to believe in. Again, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, you get the idea, right? You have the burden of proof. So you can try all you want to make me defend what is the status quo, but the null position is what we can see and what we can observe. We see physics, we see chemistry, we both agree. We agree that physics exists. We agree that chemistry exists. We agree that rocks and trees and animals exist. What we don't agree on is the supernatural bit. So this is the extra ontology, the complex ontology, these new classes of items that you have to provide burden of proof for. And if you want to keep burden shifting, I suggest we move on to another topic like morality, and you can maybe explain why you think supernaturalism is based on reliable evidential methods, because I'd really love to hear that as an alternative to my naturalistic views. And why don't you go ahead? Mike is yours.
Perhaps you don't remember what the debate title is of the room, or the debate topic is. Here it is. This is exactly what we agreed on. Is atheism the proper worldview to have? It's on, the burden of proof is on you taking the affirmative to demonstrate that that is the position. All I have to do is sit here and pick your arguments apart. That's all I got to do, and that's what I am doing. But you are not demonstrating that your position is the right one to hold, proper. Is it proper intellectually, proper morally? That's not defined. But nevertheless, you've not demonstrated that it is the proper worldview to have. You have mentioned naturalism. And I have demonstrated to you, or tried to demonstrate to you, that naturalistic worldview presupposes limits to physicality. And it means that the physical brain will operate only within the limits of physics and chemistry. The question is, how does such a physical limitation produce proper logical inference? If you want to go to a computer and a calculator and then ask about a calculator becoming sentient, well then please do. Go ahead and do that. I'll get a bag of popcorn. I'll sit back and listen to you tell us how non-sentient things become sentient. That'd be interesting for you to do. I'd like to hear that. But I don't go to such arguments. I try and stick with as much as logic as I possibly can and not get back into the things I don't believe are logically possible. I don't believe calculators can become sentient. If you want to postulate that as a defense for your argument, please do. I'd like that. That'd be interesting. Now, it's not being incredulous at simple chemicals. It's not being incredulous when I ask how simple chemicals can produce logical inference. It's not a problem. It's not an incredulous. It's not, or you say you find it incredulous that I would ask. Well, maybe you don't understand the argument. I don't know. But the issue is that if you understood that simple chemical reactions cannot be demonstrated how they can produce proper logical inference, and that's what it means inside of your naturalism. If you don't understand that, we should discuss that some more, because it does put a huge stick in your atheistic eye. It means that you're not able to demonstrate that your position is cogent, is rationally sound. It means you cannot provide a means by which you can trust the logical inferences that you thus produce. I'm not saying certain things like calculators and computers can't be produced and at the hands of intelligence, of course, and then produce proper logical inference, but they're not sentient. They're not chemical reactions. They are prearranged, designed things. If you want to use that, instead, we can talk about a design theory. That'd be great, another debate. But the burden of proof is still on you. It's not on me. You're the one doing the burden of proof shifting. Is atheism the proper worldview to have? That's the burden of proof on you to demonstrate. If the debate was, does a Christian God exist? Then it's on me to do that. And I would do my best to try and assert that. But that's not the debate here. I think you need to stick with the topic and try and demonstrate to me, try and demonstrate to others that atheism is the proper worldview to have. So far, you failed to do it in the issue of naturalism and morality. Go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. So I actually did provide an argument for why my worldview is proper, both in terms of truth and intellectual honesty, in terms of moral superiority in several ways. Now, talking about the burden shifting, right? My worldview is the proper worldview because it's the null position or the default position, and which I've argued for. I've argued for why you have the burden of proof, talking about the size of your ontology, the complexity, the new class of items you're introducing. So you have the burden of proof. And you haven't met your burden of proof for any supernaturalism. So I'm offering the default position or the null position. You have the burden, which I've also provided support for that premise, and you haven't even attempted to meet your burden. Thus, sticking with the default position works, and this is a deductive logical argument. Next, brains are made of cells, right? Cells obey physics. Calculators obey physics. Physics is currently in the process of sending a rocket to land on a comet. It's going to be a 7-hour descent. We're going to land on a comet. Pretty cool, right? So physics works for rockets and calculators, but somehow when we get to cells and human brains, physics and chemistry no longer work, barring supernaturalism. I don't see how supernaturalism is involved here. Again, we have no idea what supernaturalism is, and we have no idea what the supernaturalistic mechanisms are. Right now, it just appears to be a placeholder for a magical solution, and I'm really not impressed by that. And I want to end with a quote by Einstein before our Q&A about the burden of proof here. To be sure, the doctrine of a personal God interfering with natural events can never be refuted in the real sense by science, for this doctrine can always take refuge in the domains which scientific knowledge has not yet able to set foot. So your supernaturalism lives in the gaps of the hard problem of consciousness. We don't know how consciousness works. Could it be supernaturalism? I'll continue with Einstein. But I am persuaded that such behavior on the part of the representatives of religion would not only be unworthy but also fatal. For a doctrine which is able to maintain itself not in clear light, but only in the dark, will of necessity lose its effect on mankind with incalculable harm to human progress. And with that, we'll end the 3-minute section and we can begin our Q&As. And I think you would start the Q&As, Matt? So a 1-minute question, 2-minute response, and 1-minute rebuttal. And I'll leave the mic to you.
Well, shall I interject for a second? We've already crossed more than 30 minutes of this back and forth, the 3-minute response, debating. So let's move on to the next level. We're listening. I think, I guess Matt should go ahead first, right? Because I think DSchiff started the other turn, the previous one. So maybe, Matt, you can ask him a question. DSchiff gets 2 minutes for responding. And then, Matt, you get 1 minute again for responding. And the next turn will be DSchiff asks you a question. And Matt, you get 2 minutes for responding. And DSchiff, again, can respond back to you for 1 minute. We can do this like 5 times. So, Matt, do you want to go ahead, take the mic, and ask him a question? You get like 1 minute now. Free mic.
My question is simple. How do you know that naturalism is the right assumption to have? It's an assumption. How do you know it's the right one? Go ahead. And I have 1 minute to respond after your 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Great. So I would say all evidence ever given, and I'm using a Bayesian definition of evidence, that something will support something if it makes it more likely than an alternative. I would say all evidence that we've ever gotten has been in support of naturalism, meaning everything we see is physics or chemistry. We see matter, we see volume, we see energy. I don't see any evidence of supernaturalism. So we both agree, if you make a list of the things we believe in, we we agree about most of the naturalistic things. I don't know if you believe in evolution, but we agree that there are people and trees and rocks and so on. But you have these extra beliefs, the supernaturalism. So certainly you also think naturalism holds. So why is this the default position? Again, I gave several reasons. Supernaturalism is a larger ontology. You believe in more things. Someone who adds extra claims has an extra burden of proof. This strikes me as straightforward. Your ontology is more complex. You have invisible things, immaterial things, supernatural, transcendent things. I don't even know what those words mean. So when you add complex, you say, oh, well, X and Y is ultra-natural, suddenly I've inherited the burden of proof when I use terms like ultra-natural, or I say things are all-powerful or infinite or perfect. When I say these grandiose claims, I inherit an extra burden. So because I'm not making these extra claims, I don't have this extra burden of supernaturalism. And that's why we're resting with naturalism based on the existing evidence of science and how conclusively and powerfully physics and particle physics and quantum physics and chemistry are able to explain our world with seemingly no need for supernaturalism. So this is a good reason to think it is the null position. Microphone is yours.
You said all evidence has been supporting of naturalism. That's illogical. You don't know all evidence, and so you can't say that. Furthermore, evidence is a subjective thing. You have a phenomena, you develop a theory, and what becomes evidence is a conceptualization. It's what evidence is of the mind. It's what you think or believe supports a certain criteria. So you're not being as scientific as you think. You say, and to say you don't see any evidence of supernaturalism is to beg the question. The reason is because what you're doing, when you presuppose naturalism and you want evidence, you want physical evidence. But supernaturalism would not be restricted to the physical realm. So you make a logic error called a category mistake. You're saying you want physical evidence for the non-physical. You want natural evidence for the non-natural. It's just a mistake in logic. It's a mistake in your approach. You made a mistake. Go ahead.
All right, on to my question. So the obligatory question. What, if anything, would cause you to reject or seriously reconsider theism or your religion in particular? What, if anything, would cause you to reject or seriously reconsider theism or your religion in particular?
What would cause me to reject or doubt my theism and Christianity, there's two main things. One is if it could be established that the internal thoughts that I've got, let me see this better, the internal system of thought that Christianity is, if it can be shown that it is self-refuting, then I would logically have to give it up. Historically speaking, if it could be reasonably demonstrated that Christ did not rise from the dead, that he was crucified and stayed buried, I would also give up my Christianity. Okay, go ahead.
So Christianity is self-refuting. I would say there's a lot of that. We have perfect moral gods doing horrendous things. We have faith as methodology. Christ rising from the dead, I mean, you're setting up a very high standard, almost unfalsifiable. So, right, to disprove your God, I have to invent a time machine and go back and follow Jesus around or something like that. So I don't know if you think that's a fair test to apply, but it doesn't strike me as any better than anything that a Muslim or a Hindu would provide, which I think, again, is then evidence that your epistemological methods are unreliable and really not very intellectually or evidentially sound. Mike is yours.
Before I ask my next question, I just want to say I'm sure that DS and myself both are biting at the bit and wanting to respond in comments in turn. Maybe we'll do that later on. Kind of interesting. But anyway, you said perfect moral God does terrific things. What gives you the right to define what is morally right and morally wrong? Now, this is a serious question. What gives you as an atheist, the right to define what is and is not morally right and wrong, so that you can then judge somebody else and actually say they really are morally right and wrong? Go ahead.
It's an interesting thing to think about it in terms of a right, which almost strikes me as, again, that For you, this is about authority, and your God has authority, and you're obedient, and thus he has the right, as if he's a king. I don't see it as having a right, right? I'm a human being. I live with other human beings. I live with non-human animals that I also care about. So my right comes from me being a human, and from me caring, from me deserving to have a good life, and from me caring about others. I'm educated in moral philosophy and philosophy in general. I have the background of my upbringing, my culture, as I said, literature, history, psychology. I have all sorts of reasons to care about morality, both for myself and for others. So that's what gives me the right to be someone concerned with morality and with moral agency. Mike is yours.
All right, so you think about it in terms of a right. Rights can be given and taken away by society. It's subjective, not objective. It varies. Your right comes from being a human and from you deserving to have a good life and caring about others. These are just assumptions. These are just self-proclamations. You deserve this, you deserve that. Okay. In other words, it's all about you and about the subjective experience that you would raise as being raised to the level of defining what is morally right and wrong based on your personal preferences and issues. But you didn't answer the question. What gives you the right to impose that on others? That is the question. And I'll just continue on with this and ask my question now. What gives you the right to impose your particular subjective moral view upon anybody else? Go ahead. Wait, I'm sorry. I think I went out of time, didn't I? I think I blew it. Isn't it you asking me a question? I think I messed up. My apologies. Fix it. Go ahead.
Apology accepted. For my question, this morality thing is really big. It seems to be almost your main point that you want to use against atheists, that we don't have a basis for morality. It's a little bit problematic. So I've always found this to be really ironic. So let's take some of your scripture from your perfectly moral God. Exodus 12:12, from God, Yahweh. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. He will bring this judgment on everyone, quote, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, all the firstborn of the cattle as well. So, do you see it as ethical or morally perfect to kill the children of relatively innocent slave girls and innocent cattle? And do you think that this at all contrasts with the idea that your perfect God is somehow against slavery and is an abolitionist? Speaking of morality here and moral consistency. Mike is yours.
All right, 2 minutes. Well, you certainly have the right to ask questions like that, but you don't have the moral right to assert that any such an event is by nature right or wrong. You have the right to say you don't agree with it, and I will defend your right, but you don't have the right to say that was wrong. You can say you don't like it. It's not about whether I like the event in Exodus 12:12 or not. The issue, biblically speaking, if you want to argue from inside the biblical worldview, all people have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 5:12. So therefore, all people are under rightful judgment of God. It's not murder; it's execution according to the law. He has the right to do with his creation as he desires. This is perfectly consistent within biblical revelation. You may not like it, and that's fine. But you, as an atheist, don't have the right to say, I'm going to take off the shelf the moral law that applies to Exodus 12:12, and I'm going to subject Exodus 12:12 to this moral law. You don't have that right because it doesn't exist. The best you can do is say, from my personal experience, my subjective ideology, which you appeal to your own ideas, your own preferences, and your own practical goals as what makes something morally right, you're saying that from that, you're going to judge another culture, another time, another situation, and you're going to pronounce that wrong. But you don't have the right to do that with authority. You have the right to do it with subjective opinion. No problem. But you don't have the right to say it is actually right, actually wrong for that to occur. You may not like it, no problem, but you can't say it is ontologically, morally the wrong thing to do, because you don't have any ontological, moral standards by which you could judge these things. You can only appeal to your subjective experience and your subjective opinions. You got a minute response. Go ahead.
So, I think it's unfortunate that your moral system requires me to have a supernatural badge, essentially, which allows me to make moral proclamations. And we can see how this is problematic because the result is that you can't really tell right from wrong, right? You can't criticize the murder of the child of an innocent slave girl. That's where your practical ethics lies, because you're obedient to whatever your God says. Now, because you can't make moral decisions for yourself, you essentially don't have moral agency. You can't decide right from wrong, and that's unfortunate and that's dangerous. I think it's incredibly ironic to have my morality criticized because I don't have a supernatural badge from someone who can't tell that killing innocent animals or killing the children of slave girls isn't wrong and thinks that it's important. That I have a supernatural badge where I can say it's officially wrong. I think this is really missing the point about what's important in our world and what's important in morality. I guess, is it my question next? No, sorry, it's your question. Mike's free.
How do you determine what is morally right and morally wrong so as to apply that moral value upon anybody else? Again, how do you determine, I'm going to say this a little bit differently, what is objectively morally right and wrong so that you can apply that moral value to others and justify that as being the right thing to do? How do you do that? Go ahead.
So generally, my normative ethical system is something like utilitarianism, specifically a rule utilitarianism, a la Peter Singer. So actually, he's an act utilitarian. Forgive me. So generally, right, I'm trying to promote the flourishing of sentient life. Right, I care about things that can actually feel. So rocks don't have feelings. There's no morality as applied to rocks. Only sentient beings can have morality applied. So what matters? Well, it's a manifest fact of experience that horrible suffering is bad. If you don't think horrible suffering is bad, I don't know what you're talking about, right? So based on this, we can tell that suffering is bad and non-suffering is better. And then it applies to agents that can feel, sentient agents. So how to determine right from wrong? I use this rule utilitarianism, that is, I try to construct the rules that when generally applied would produce the best results for people. Again, better societies, more wealth, more education, better health, those kinds of things, things which most people agree on, not things like killing the children of slave girls. I also use Aristotelian virtue ethics to judge people. So I consider that people can be indoctrinated and can be mistaken and can be confused. But they're trying to do the right thing. If someone is trying to do the right thing and they have good intentions, even if they make a mistake, I consider them as having that sense of virtue. So those would be the two normative ethical frameworks I would use to help distinguish good results from bad results, and thus good policies or good rules from bad policies and rules. Mike is yours.
I'm getting confused. I have a minute response. Is that correct, moderator? Going through so much here so fast. Is that correct? Okay, thank you very much. Let me start then. So your view of morality is utilitarian. Well, that's quite problematic. So if I were to rob you at gunpoint because it serves my interests, it's utilitarian for me, then it's the right thing to do. If 10 of us need what you have, so 10 of us can be more prosperous, and we were to rob you, then by your definition of utilitarian ethics, then it is the ethical thing to do. You say horrible suffering is bad. Well, it's not clear what sense you mean is bad. Morally bad? Well, that's the issue at hand. Physically bad? Heck yeah. I don't like physical suffering. Is it morally wrong? Well, I don't know. My gallbladder died and I had a kidney stone. It wasn't a moral issue. It was physically bad. It was not a moral issue. You try to construct a rule that generally would produce the best results for people. So you shift the moral necessity onto the goal. How do you know that the goal is the right one? You keep getting back to the subjective issue. You see the goal, you see the reasons, you see the utilitarian means as the proper means by which you can judge a moral thing. But you're not justifying using that object as a moral thing. So let me continue on with my question then. We're done with the tense. Okay, I'm done. So let me ask my question. We have time for, are we still going this? Do I do one more or are we done? It's his turn? I ask a question. Sorry. Is it my turn? I'm not trying to do this wrong. Both of us are just so involved in listening that we kind of lose track. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, DS. I apologize. Dang it. I do apologize. Go ahead.
No, that's just fine. It can be a bit confusing. Since you're a little bit phased by our best attempt to provide utilitarian results for as many beings as possible, you must have an alternative moral system, and this is one thing that I believe is part of your moral framework that I think is deeply, deeply problematic and very harmful for most of recent history. So let me give you an example of this. In Exodus 20 and Exodus 34, where the Ten Commandments are given, and these are supposed to be the moral bases of society and the 10 great rules from God, even though several of them are, again, about obedience, not about morality. It is said, again, this is Yahweh, and he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. So my question is it fair to punish people for the crimes of other people to the third and fourth demonstration as demonstrated here, or say to punish someone's descendants indefinitely as seen through the Adam and Eve story? Similarly, is it fair to then exonerate people through the punishment of a third party, such as through the scapegoating of Jesus? I would propose that individuals are morally responsible for their own actions and can't be blamed or forgiven by actions done to or by their ancestors. So please tell me if this is or is not part of your moral framework. Mic is yours.
Sorry about that. I had a little bit of a mic problem. You're asking a theological question. This isn't germane to the debate. The debate is atheism the proper worldview to hold? And it's not about the moral ethical system of Exodus 20. But nevertheless, there's an answer to that on the website. There's a sense in which the sins of the fathers are, and a sense in which the sins of the father are not carried down. One sense is that if I were to take my children to a desert island, and I wanted them to survive there, they suffer because of my sin. And so, therefore, they will suffer the consequences of my sin, and that's one context. Another one is that God will not make Bob pay for Frank's sin. It doesn't work like that. We get into some theological issues of federal headship. If you want to have a Bible study sometime, we can do that. But my moral system is based on the revelation of God. It's therefore objective. And that's just part of my notes. You said, is it fair to punish people for the crimes of other people? Well, from your perspective, it's irrelevant. You see, whether or not someone is punished for somebody else's grievances, problems, crimes, whatever you want to call it, so you're an atheist. You see, you may say it's inconvenient, you may say you don't like it, you may say it's not good, not preferential, whatever. But you can't say it's morally right or morally wrong. In order to do that, you'd have to say that there is some standard by which you can appeal to, that you can therefore assert that that particular action has a morally offensive quality to it. But how do you have such a standard in your naturalistic world? Your naturalistic world, how does one chemical state that leads to another chemical state produce proper logical inference, and how does it produce proper moral inference as well? How do you get a proper moral inference? The only way to do that is to presuppose that there is a supernatural lawgiver, logic giver, moral lawgiver, by which you were to inquire of, so that you would then be able to make certain assertions. So far, you've been inconsistent with your own worldview. You've not demonstrated your worldview as a proper one to hold. You've made emotional arguments, but you've not made any cogent intellectual ones. Done.
Great. So it seems like you actually you didn't think that people should inherit the sins of someone else. And yet, this is the essence of the Adam and Eve story, that we all are to blame for what Eve did, even though she had not yet eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She didn't even know right from wrong, and she was punished horribly. What message does this send? It sends a message that obedience is what's important. Morality, even if you don't even know what's right or wrong, obedience will get you and your descendants punished. And similarly, you have your Savior is a human sacrifice, right? This is ancient scapegoating. You pile the sins of a tribe on a goat and you slit its throat, or you send it to the desert or off a cliff to die, and thus you get rid of the tribes of the sins of the tribe. That's not how morality works. So this is what happens when you use Iron Age or Bronze Age ethics. You result in a system where what matters to you is a supernatural badge, and the supernatural badge is equivalent to obedience, and your obedience is to interpretations of a capricious and cruel entity who kills the innocent children of slave girls. No more needs to be said. Should we move on to audience Q&A, Matt? What do you think? I'm open for that. Great. So what do you think? Should they ask questions of one of us, or maybe both of us have the chance to weigh in? Something like that? I propose they can go on mic, put their hands up, and then you and I will take turns responding and alternate. Or we can alternate if you don't want to chime in, you don't have to. Great. All right, Mike. Mike's son, let's hear your question.
Well, I think Matt was kind of escaping that thing about you asking him. There's a section where God is not just going to punish the wrongdoer, but the children of them, the children of them, the children of them. And immediately comes to me, even the mob didn't do that. Even when the mob wanted to send a message, they did not go out and kill each other's children. And you ask him that, and he goes, oh, that doesn't really matter. That's an atheist problem, and you atheists don't care. So, Matt, you got to answer that directly. There's parts of the Bible that says you punish the wrongdoer and their children. I'm the child of a wrongdoer. My father murdered somebody. Why in hell would I be punished? Please explain. Why should I be punished? Why would a God? How can you picture a God so big, so benevolent? He's going to punish me for what my father did. Please explain that to the room, off the mic.
I don't understand what this question is. Please, can you type it out?
I think it had something to do with he thought that the idea of vicarious inheritance of sin was inappropriate and didn't feel that you had addressed the issues I presented in Exodus 20 and 34. Let me know if that's enough for you to provide a response.
Well, you're talking about two different things. The moral responsibility and inheritance sin deals with imputation. Look, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about theological issues here. Do you want me to do a Bible study here in federal headship and representation? Vicarious, the nature of atonement, what it means to be in Christ, in Adam. I can get into the Bible study if you want, but we don't have enough time in 2 minutes to do this. So I'm not able to put this all down and distill this down into basically no time. I do have articles on my website if you're interested in reading them. I can put a list of things in there so you can check things out. And I'm not trying to get out of this and just say don't have an answer. Yes, I do have an answer. I do. I teach on these things. It takes a bit to lay the foundation, intellectual and biblical foundation, for people to understand what the Bible is actually teaching. Should the person be punished for the father's wrongdoing? It depends. Depends on what the context is. You can't say it's a universal principle right now unless we know all context. Let me put in a link to the article on this, okay? Sorry, I just don't have the ability in the restricted time to be able to answer super complex questions which require theological examination. Go ahead.
All right, I guess it's my question for DSchiff.
Hey, sorry, Radical. I was just going to do my response first, and then we'd love to hear your question. So we'll remember that you're next on mic. There you go, you're undotted. Sorry about that. So, that's fine. Well, Matt, while you weren't able to provide an answer in 2 minutes, I can, right? Inheriting the sins of your ancestors is starkly, incredibly immoral. I don't know how, it's not obvious to everyone that it's immoral. If you punch someone in the face, I shouldn't punch your child. If you murder someone, I shouldn't throw your child in jail. This is a clear moral principle if anything is clear. So having this as an ethical basis of your religion, having original sin, having inheritance, having this kind of punishment to the third and fourth generation instantiated in the Ten Commandments is deeply troubling and deeply problematic. And it's not a coincidence that you then have many, many people who inherit this ideology and are willing to overlook genocide or promote slavery, or in general just don't have moral agency and will support any cruel and immoral act, as long as there's a supernatural badge of approval. And this leads to all of the sort of the cruel wars and the cruel behaviors. So, I really think it's important to recover our moral agency as a society, not to be obedient when we don't really have reasons apart from that supernaturally someone is the official boss. That's not a good reason to follow someone, especially when their moral rules are clearly immoral. So that's my clear answer, really, in 2 minutes, and I think it goes to demonstrate that your view is not, and my worldview, my atheistic worldview, is the proper worldview. I guess radical, moderate, you are next time, Mike. Thanks for the question, Mike son.
All right, thank you very much. Can I get a mic check? And that was my bad. I forgot that you were going to give a response. Okay. I'm sorry, but this is the way it is, dude. This is it. Okay, so my question is to DSchiff. You haven't turned on your speakers. My question is to DSchiff. You seem to be of the argument, again, if I'm misrepresenting, I do apologize, but you seem to say that what you judge morality by, or what gives you the moral decision, is that you are for what benefits society or benefits the most people in society, the best way possible. Then you just made the argument for ISIS, because that's what ISIS is fighting, killing, and dying for right now, is to benefit their society, their Islamic society, the majority of the Sunni population. And I got news for you, the Sunnis who are living in those regions actually love ISIS. They feel their lives are bettered by it. They can go and buy a gallon of gasoline and not have to worry if it has half water in it. They can go buy a kilo of beef and know that it's beef and not lamb mixed in. So yes, these people, their lives are being empowered by ISIS in the region that ISIS is in control. So how would you stand against ISIS? I mean, after all, they're doing what you say you want to be done. Your mic.
Thanks, Radical. I think I got your question from that. So you suggest that ISIS wants to benefit society in the most way possible, but then you qualified they really want to benefit themselves. They want to benefit the Sunnis. Of course, that's different from my worldview, right? I don't just want to benefit Sunnis or just want to benefit atheists. Nor, and you missed this, I don't just want to benefit humans. I believe that non-human animals, sentient life, also have value, and that we should care about animal life and animal well-being as well, which is something that religion has largely overlooked, which is a huge moral failure. So, again, ISIS doesn't want to benefit all of society. Their practical ethics are very different from mine. I don't think you can make a good case that mass executing and beheading people is really benefiting society. And it's really interesting, too, because ISIS is actually an example of a religious worldview. They're not atheists, right? ISIS, they're religious. They believe in Allah. They believe in Yahweh. They believe in the infallibility of the Quran. Their meta-ethical method is divine command theory. Their God has a supernatural badge, and this is what their God says. And if their God says kill innocents and kill children and kill infidels, then their God's rules go because they are obedient, and that is what their morality is. So ISIS is actually a great example of how religious ethics lead to things like ISIS. Whereas my utilitarian ethics, the flourishing of and well-being of sentient life, does not permit things like mass executions and beheadings, or exclusivism or favoritism or hellfire. So there's really very little about their worldview that is compatible with mine. It's a great demonstration, again, for how my worldview is morally superior. Matt, go ahead.
There is no moral superiority in your view. It's just an opinion. I keep bringing this up, and you keep ignoring this, flat out ignoring this. You have the right to a personal opinion. What justifies your opinion as being the right one that others should follow? This is a question I've asked in different ways many times, and you've just not dealt with it. If you appeal to society, you're appealing to argumentative ad populum. You're simply saying that the majority wants it. This is another problem. It's a fallacy of argumentation. It's a fallacy of logic. You have the right to your opinion about things. That's great. But you talk about the supernatural badge. Well, I'm just talking here about the naturalistic badge. And what gives you the right in your naturalistic badge to stand on top of a mountain and say, hey, this is morally right, that's morally wrong. You don't have that ability. For you to say something is by nature morally right or morally wrong is to appeal to something outside of yourself. But a natural ontological essence to an action is right or is wrong. But how do you have that in a purely naturalistic worldview of chemical reactions? You can't. This is why your position is self-refuting. It's self-refuting in the issue of logic and it's self-refuting in the issue of morality. What you're doing is you're standing on my worldview. You hit one foot in my worldview and one foot in your worldview, and you go back and forth. You say, look, I'm going to appeal to a type of universal moral standard, and I'm going to use it against the ones who's got a universal moral standard, but I can't have a universal moral standard because I'm an atheist. There's an inconsistency in your approach, and you are self-refuting in this in various ways, which I pointed out numerous times in numerous ways, and which I've noticed you have avoided addressing the difficult issues here. As far as the thing about the sins of the fathers, I have presented the link that you guys are welcome to go read and check out the argument which I put up years ago about that. Go ahead, next question.
Okay, so I'm guessing that both debaters are responding to the topic, so I'll give something for both debaters to respond to. I don't feel like Matt Slick's transcendental argument was addressed well enough or delved into enough. And I feel like Matt Slick is primarily known for touting his transcendental argument. So my question for DS is, how do you think you did on dealing with the transcendental argument? Would you deal with it differently? And my question to Matt Slick is, would you like to have a debate structured very much like this with someone who is formally trained in logic and will wipe the floor with you when it comes to the transcendental argument? We can talk in private about the parameters of the debate and agree upon that. I promise I'll be polite. I'm not always a jerk, but that's it. Thank you, Mike Free.
I think, are you first this time, Matt? Since I believe was I first last time? Okay, we can break the order. So as for tag, I don't think Matt really got into it that much. I don't think it really got off the ground, and I don't think that supernaturalism does anything to justify logic any better than naturalism. I don't think supernaturalism first is defined enough to be coherent or intelligible, and I don't see how supernatural mechanisms are even supposed to explain logic in the first place, apart from creating supernatural metaphysics where one of the rules is supernatural metaphysics explain logic. So it's entirely vacuous from my perspective. On the other hand, in a naturalistic perspective, logical rules, which are just observations written down about descriptions, rules written down about observations, are self-evident as far as I'm concerned. Something equals itself. Do I need a supernatural justification? No, I don't. I can see something, I see that thing, it is a thing. I see a star, it's a star. I see a rock, it's a rock. Non-contradiction also strikes me as self-evident. So, as I said, I don't think that tag actually really has any merit whatsoever. Yes, these are my subjective opinions, but my subjective opinions are better than the subjective opinions of a God that, again, wants to kill the children of innocent slave girls. And my logic, and I'm also formally trained in logic. I have a degree in philosophy. Is better than the logical systems provided by Iron Age religion, whichever religion you're talking about. Matt, why don't you go ahead?
Well, to respond to what you said there, you're the one appealing to transcendentals. You're the one saying that certain actions are naturally wrong and universally wrong, that everybody would know that these things are wrong, as you keep saying, this innocent slave child or a slave girl. But you're just begging the question in that. You're assuming that all of these slave girls are just innocent. You just beg the question. You do this repeatedly. And what you're doing is saying, well, this is naturally and ontologically wrong. Really? I've asked this question. How do you have such natural ontological moral rights and wrongs in an atheistic worldview that has presupposed the value of the condition of naturalism? You see, What you're doing is you're saying this various wired brain and that wired brain, they're the ones appealing to something that is, you say, naturally morally wrong. They know that there's some standard. What you are doing is appealing to a transcendental. A transcendental is something that is universally true, that is not dependent upon the individual or space and time. You're saying that it is true. You don't even get it. You're arguing against your own position when you argue for universal morals. I mean, you've actually defeated yourself. It's just really, you have. Because you only have a subjective opinion. I keep bringing this up in different ways. Now, to technically answer the question, would I like to have a debate with someone who's formally trained in logic and would clean the floor with me? Would I like that? Would I like to have my clock cleaned and have clean the floor with me? No, I would not like that. There's the answer to that question. Go ahead.
Nightmare, that's you, man.
Nightmare, NYT Mayor, ATU, your question on the mic now. Go ahead, you can take 2 minutes. Open mic.
Can you guys hear me right now? Just want to make sure before I ask the question. Yes? Okay, hold on. Okay, I just locked the mic because I have my question written down. This is my question. I don't have any statements or comments to make. My question is, how can we say in a debate topic that only one side has a burden of proof when normative debate ethics would say we have a shared burden when the topic under contention is phrased in the form of a question? That's my question.
Okay, well, Matt didn't get the question, so can you just repeat that again? Nightmare 8, can you simply repeat the question again to Matt? Open mic. Nightmare 8U, did you hear me on the mic? Can you just repeat the question once more, just so Matt can hear it?
Okay, I don't know if Nightmare's there. I think his question was something like, is it fair or reasonable to set a debate topic that's one-sided and only prompts one side to respond? Is that reasonable in terms of debate ethics? Let me know if that's a fair rendition of your question, Nightmare. No? Okay, then you better get on mic and explain it.
You guys hear me right now? Okay, can you guys hear me right now? Basically what I'm asking is, if the proposition under contention in a debate was, God does not exist, we would understand that the atheist has the burden of proof, right? If the debate topic was, God does exist, the Christian would have the burden of proof. But in the case of the form of a query, right, like, does God exist? Wouldn't there be a shared burden of proof, a burden of refutation, as well as a burden of proof? You see what I'm trying to say? For the affirmative as well as the negative. And that's a question to both Matt. Right. If it's forming a question, isn't there a shared burden of proof? This is known as the burden of refutation. That's what I'm asking about.
I guess I'll go first. I've been in debates before, formal debates, where the title has been a question. does God exist? I've debated Eddie Tabash, I've debated Edwin Kagan, and I've debated Dan Barker. I believe, and I hope my memory serves me correctly, each one was formed in a question. And in each instance, I was the one who had to go first. And please, folks, if I'm not getting my facts right, my apologies. I'm just trying to remember best I can, because some of these debates happened years ago. But I do, if I remember correctly, I had to go forward first because I was taking the affirmative position. Yes, God does exist, and then they had to respond to that. In this one, it was, is atheism the proper worldview? And he has the affirmative, and so the affirmative position traditionally goes first. It doesn't mean that it always has to be that way, but that's just traditionally how it's been. That's what I understand in debate stuff. But I'm no expert on what the rules are of debate protocol. Go ahead.
So, I think you would agree, Matt, that the debate challenge itself wasn't the most polite debate challenge and acceptance you've ever engaged in. I certainly feel that way, and I regret that. But, yeah, I do think it's an inappropriate question, right? You essentially only let me accept this one topic. I wanted to provide a different topic that I thought was more neutral. I think this is what we're getting at. Now, I do think that it generally has to be the theist because of the reasons I've offered, I think at least twice, if not three times, for why I think supernaturalists have the burden of proof. And that's why I think you really are defending your position most of the time. Another issue, of course, was that I don't know any atheist who actually conceives of atheism as a worldview. As I said, a worldview contains at least a metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, if not views on aesthetics and politics and so on. And atheism, as you agreed, is just lack of belief in maybe one set or one ontological position. So it's not even a positive view, much less a comprehensive metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical worldview. So you forced me to adapt to actually have something substantive to discuss. But yeah, I do think that a debate topic should be a little bit more balanced and should have a burden of proof that is well conceived from the start, which I know is a problem because you don't actually see yourself as having the burden. Thanks for the question. Mike's up to Lover, I guess.
Did I already respond? I'm getting confused. Is it my turn to respond to what you just said, or are we done? It's my turn to respond to you? Okay. No, I thought I already did. Isn't that right, Pink? I'll go with whatever you say. I did. Okay. Hey, this happens. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hello, can I be heard? Okay. Here's my problem with all of this. You all are speaking about a God who you think is real or think doesn't exist, and yet he left us his words for all of us to understand who he is. But the problem is we have one source and everybody's coming up with biased opinions, which means the people in mass are lying. There's only, according to this book, the Bible, that everybody claims to believe some aspect of it, there's only one God, one spirit, that he has one people, Jew and Gentile, led by his one spirit, who all speak the same one truth. So if you're not speaking this one truth, you are deceived. Now, he leaves biblical evidence to prove who's a legitimate son of his and who's not. For example, I spoke the truth earlier about the one sign, taken up in Matthew chapter 12, 38, 40, which are not my words, which are his words that have been documented for 2,000 years. Now, the Jews failed at understanding this one sign. That's why, as a nation, they were all cut off. My righteous claim is to this day, every one of you in this room, the 7 billion of you on this earth, you all have fallen and stumbled at the same sign, which means you don't know him.
I'm sorry, but there is a small problem. Matt Slick is not able to hear. Sorry, Lover, I had to red dot you. Do you have your mic fixed now? Is everyone else able to hear me? Is everyone else able to hear me? Okay, good. I will undot you, Lover of Truth. but you will have to ask your question again. Okay? Some people were not able to hear you. Free mic.
Can I be heard better now? I saw one come up before when I asked that question, and I see another one from Pink Elephant, so I assume that you can hear me. Well, can you hear me, Pink, Matt Slick?
Hey, Lover, it appears he can't hear you. How about you type your question in text, and then maybe we can respond to that. I think we should move on to the next question. So please type your question in text, Lover. Thanks. Go ahead, Midnight.
Could I get a mic check? Alright, let me see if I can get this question alright, because I'm on painkillers. The question's for Matt, and I'd like to hear your response to Schiff. Matt, I'm in agreement with you that atheism doesn't really have an objective grounding for morality. It does arbitrarily ground it in reducing pain or whatever, without demonstrating why pain is necessarily a bad thing, even when it doesn't seem that it is. But theologically and philosophically, what is the problem with having morality just subjective all around? I've seen you make an appeal to an emotion, and a lot of people buckle on it when you say, is it ever okay to torture a baby for fun? Most people won't say yes. But in a subjective moral world, yes, it is okay. In a world where it's okay, it's okay. So what is the problem with my question is, what is the problem with subjective morality, even in a Christian worldview? God being the most powerful being in the universe, it still means that it's just his subjective morality. I don't see any objective grounding for morality anywhere in the universe, even with God's power. All right.
Matt Slick, you want to respond first?
Yes, give me an extra couple seconds each time because I had to finish my notes so that I can try and respond properly. Sorry about that. You're right. Pain is an arbitrary standard of morality. I don't like pain. It hurts too much. That's why I don't like it. But is it the right moral standard? Anyway, what's the problem with morality being subjective all around? I come over to your house and I say, I want your, whatever, TV. I have a gun. You say you can't do that. I don't care. Morality is nothing but subjectivity. It's subjective to me, and therefore I want what you have, so therefore I get to take what you have. If you say you don't like that, I say, I don't care. I'm not into objective morality, that it's universally true. I'm into subjective morality. It's subjective according to what I want, so therefore I'm taking it. That's what subjective morality is. Objective morality means that there's a standard outside of both of us that we have to appeal to. And that's the difference between them. So if everything is subjective morally, then nothing is right morally. That would be the thing. Things might be inconvenient, might be problematic. And you said God is subjective. No, God is absolute. From the Christian perspective, we would say he is immutable, eternal, and he has a quality called aseity. So he's non-contingent and unchanging. And morality would be based out of his absolute standard. And it would be objective as it relates to us. And since atheists don't have God to appeal to, they can't appeal to an objective standard, only to one that is their subjective standard or a collection of subjective standards in society. Go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. So let's take a moral claim we probably agree on in applied ethics. Torturing a child is generally a bad thing to do. Is generally wrong. Well, let's give a naturalistic explanation. Torturing a child is bad because it causes immense suffering. It deprives them of having a good, valuable life. Or let's take a supernaturalistic explanation. Suffering is bad because torturing a child is bad because God says so. Now, which of these is more robust? Which of these is meaningful? Is God says so? Is that a meaningful answer? Is friendship good because God says so? is love good because God says so, or is love good because of the natural reasons we can understand? And what I would submit to you is that the natural reasons, we can combine the two, and the supernatural reason does nothing for it. Why is child torture bad? Because it deprives them of well-being and hurts them, and God says so. The God says so clause does nothing for you. So the naturalistic explanation is all that matters. In Matt's meta-ethics, his God may have an objective badge of authority, but again, that morality is just obedience. So while pain may be quasi-arbitrary, if you really think torture, having that as a stance is arbitrary, obedience is utterly arbitrary. That's what we have the Euthyphro dilemma. Is what is pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or the other way around? And you have the modified version if you want to get into the aseity transcendence paradox. If it's really that if God is identical to his moral properties, then is he good because he has those moral properties, or are those moral properties good in virtue of him having them? So it's in either case, it's arbitrary, or the morality logically precedes a God. So we really need to judge our ethics on the best available evidence and the best available reasons. And these are naturalistic reasons that we can appeal to and understand. We can understand why rape is bad. Supernatural badges, God says so or God makes it so, does nothing. And that's why my atheistic worldview, again, is the proper one, is morally superior. Radical, you're up.
All right. Well, I guess this is a follow-up to my initial question, which thank you for answering that. And with some of the things that you said, so you said that your position is morally superior to that of ISIS because yours is all-inclusive. But in order to implement your morally superior morality, you would have to exclude ISIS. So therefore, your brand of morality would be exclusive to a vast swath of people, let's say probably about 500 million Sunni Muslims. So that's point number one. And point number two, how would you implement this moral superiority over ISIS? I mean, how would you stop ISIS from practicing what you would consider immorality? And one more point. You said that regular morality with God, disobedience, but wouldn't people need to be obedient to you and your moral superiority in order for your moral superior system to work? Or is your moral superiority just based on chaos? And so I hope you've gotten my questions. I'm off the mic.
I'm not sure I heard the first bit of that, and you cut off for a little bit. It's something to do with, how can I assert my moral superiority over ISIS? How can I say that my moral worldview is better? Well, there are a few ways. First, a moral worldview is clearly inferior if it's based on fiction. So if my moral principle is to sacrifice virgins to bring about the rain, that's clearly inferior because there are no gods that will bring rain because of sacrificing virgins. In the same way, ISIS's worldview is based on fiction, so we can tell it's inferior. So their worldview is again based on the same kinds of evidence that Matt has: authority, tradition, faith, miracle claims. Whereas mine is based on the best and most modern evidence, and thus it's more beneficent. So how do I impose this over them? Well, I mean, you're talking about tough political questions at this point. Do you kill people? Do you try to inform societies by investing in their development educationally and in terms of their infrastructure and society, and hope that they reform their views? And I think part of it is that you really want to undermine religion to the extent that people like people in ISIS don't have moral agency. They do whatever someone says their book says. There may be disagreement in my worldview among naturalists, but there's also disagreement among the religious. So if we can help convince ISIS and future generations of people in the developing world that they shouldn't just do whatever a God says, especially when that God is in very, very cruel scriptures, then we can help people think for themselves and realize that it's not about just helping my internal group and killing everyone else, but it's about helping everyone. And we can expand our circle of sentiment to care about more people and to care about animals. So I think this is the road we have to take to try to convince the world to abandon views like Matt's and adopt better views like mine. Mike is yours, Matt.
Well, how how you can implement your view is to do it the same way Stalin did, Lenin did, Mao Zedong did. In the 1900s, the atheistic regimes killed over 100 million people. You cannot even anywhere get anything religiously remote to that as far as numbers go. I've got documentation on my website. It's a huge issue. But, we're way off topic here. These kind of things are just digressing into he said, she said kind of thing. I don't need to get into that and don't want to. The real debate is on the validity of the atheistic worldview. We want to talk about morality. Well, we have to appeal to something here. If, DSchiff, if you are going to appeal to universals, you're refuting your own worldview. If you're going to say that something is in itself and of itself morally right or morally wrong, therefore you're saying an action has a universal appeal, universal necessity of obligation to follow. You are saying that it's a transcendental issue. You're saying that the moral value of transcendental equality. But you can't have transcendental moral truth values in your naturalistic worldview. It just doesn't work. You are self-refuting. You're arguing against yourself when you say this. I have a reason for saying ISIS is wrong. I appeal to the Word of God. I appeal to the New Testament. Love your enemies. God has said don't go out and murder them. God does not murder. That's a whole other topic. We can talk about that. But these people are doing this. Now we can get into the issue of why Islam is bad. And we can talk about that on ISIS itself. At least as a Christian, I have an objective standard by which I can say, oh, they're wrong. Atheists, you certainly have the right to say you don't agree with them, and I'm glad you do say that they are wrong. But you don't have an objective, transcendental standard by which you can assert that it is actually, ontologically, morally wrong. You don't have that ability. You simply have the ability to say, it's my opinion, and along with other atheists who agree with me, and then type mean things in there, we're therefore right. It's not how an argument goes. You have to have something more substantial than simply a set of opinions that cannot be substantiated in the transcendentals, which DSchiff you are appealing to. Repeatedly, you're refuting yourself. You don't realize it then. Go ahead.
Just in case anyone's curious, the argument that Matt Slick is making is a popularized argument by a man named Thomas More, who was himself an atheist, but argued that a naturalistic conception of morality could never exist. You always and forever had to have an unnatural or non-natural or even supernatural foundation for your ethics. So this does have a long history in philosophy. But Matt Slick, I would like to ask you in a polite manner, would you care to debate the question of whether or not an atheistic worldview, and by that I simply mean any worldview that does not condone the existence of a deity, can any atheistic worldview account for the systems of logic or laws of logic? However you want to phrase that. We'll work on the phrasing, but the important part is I have a refutation for your tag argument. Furthermore, I have a reason why God could never be the foundation for logic. So not only can I provide a counterexample for your argument, I can show you why your arguments can never hold. So I can attack you on two fronts, and I don't believe anyone has ever brought that second objection to you. Mike 3.
You want to go first, Matt Slick, followed by DSchiff?
Yeah, I just need like 2 extra seconds. It's twice. Right when I'm hitting the button, I can type my notes out. Yeah, I'll go first. Sounds interesting. Could you write them down? Because write the arguments down. I'd love to see them and work with them. Because if you present them orally, I may just spend the time saying, let me see if I understand, let me see if I understand. And it wouldn't be a debate. It'd be, okay, what's this again? What's this again? What's this again? Because I like to really analyze them. You can I'm serious. If you could do that, I'd love to do that. Carmstuff@yahoo.com. I care to debate whether the atheistic worldview and any worldview that does not condone justice God account for the laws of logic. Okay, would I care to debate whether the atheistic worldview or any worldview that does not condone God's existence can account for the laws of logic? I might be willing to do that. I am of the opinion that you can't do that without God. I'm not saying atheists. A lot of people don't realize what I actually teach. I believe atheists can be ethical and atheists can be moral. I teach that. I say that. What I say is they don't have an intellectual justification for that morality and the objective standard, or sorry, I just heard a noise. I'm at the house, and I just heard a disturbing noise. Can you please just bear with me a minute? I'll be right back. Sorry.
DSchiff, your response.
Sure, I guess I might as well offer, because it was mostly directed for Matt. Were you thinking non-serve of running Cantor's proof or uncountability vis-a-vis an omniscient God is impossible and thus can't be the moral standard, or some other argument? I'm just curious. Go ahead, Matt. You can finish your thing. Something modified? Cool.
Well, thank you for that. I apologize. I heard what I thought was a scream coming out from outside in the hallway, a faint one. So as a father, I got to go check. My daughter says, no, nothing. So I have no idea what that was. I lost my train of thought. So at any rate, I do apologize for that. Thanks for being gracious about that, DS. I appreciate that. Go ahead. Which daughter, Silver? Go ahead.
Oh, I just was wondering if non-serve was going to run an uncountability proof from Cantor about how your God can't be omniscient. I'm sure you guys can have that debate another time. The question was mostly directed to you. Rapture, why don't you take the mic? We'd love to hear your question.
Well, thank you, DS. My question is really short, sweet, and succinct, and you know that, Matt. You know that we have specific questions. So, let me start by this. I'll just lay a 30-second outlay of what you supposedly what your worldview is first, Matt. Before I ask my question, your worldview supposes a God of the Bible that basically has predestined everything. He's predestined who's going to be saved. He's predestined who's going to be damned to hell. He's predestined all of that. You believe in a form of what they call today modern Reformed theology. Right, Matt? Reformed theology. In other words, Calvinism. In other words, Jesus didn't really die for everybody. He only died for a select few. Therefore, all you have to do is realize that selection, I guess. Right? The selection of whether he died for you or he didn't die for you. Right, Matt? So I'm wondering, Matt, according to Romans chapter 1, where it says, no man has an excuse before God, what makes Matt Slick any different from an atheist? That's what I'm asking you, Matt Slick. What makes you any different from the atheist who thinks that they have an excuse before God in actually embracing the same theology or worldview that you do? Here, let me repeat the question in case you didn't get it, Matt. If you believe that people are predestined to hell or heaven, what makes you any different from the atheist who also uses that excuse before God in saying, well, hey, you're the one that knows my destination. What do you have to do with this? Go ahead, Matt.
The question is not germane to the topic at hand. Next.
Wow. Yeah, you are really no good at debate.
Okay, we need to follow up there. I guess I'll respond. I think it's close enough, right? As atheism, proper worldview, we can talk about this is a criticism of theism, the criticism of Calvinism, which would say that your worldview is bad, and I can argue that my worldview is thus better. And I think if you're a Calvinist, Matt, is this correct? Sure, why not? If you're a Calvinist, I think you cripple anything vital about free will in the first place. And again, it undermines any sort of morality in your topic, as long as you respond to the topic. So, people are born and they're predestined to hell. So for a finite amount of finite sins, things that aren't even bad, right? Things like working on the Sabbath, things like not being born into the wrong country and following the wrong religion, being a nurse in India who's a Hindu, you're destined to hell for eternity. Infinite punishment for finite sin. If you punch me, Matt, in the face, and I punch you back, I'm not doing the right thing, right? 2 wrongs don't make a right. If I punch you back 10 times, that's disproportionate. If I punch you back 1,000 times, that's way disproportionate. If I lock you up in a room and I attach chemicals and I torture you forever, that's infinitely disproportionate. So your hell is infinitely evil. Infinite punishment for finite sin. Infinitely unjust. Infinitely evil. So you have an infinitely evil rule from a God which is supposed to be perfectly moral. Perfect morality, infinite evil. It's a perfect contradiction. So I think this is a result of Calvinism, that what you have, that innocent people have essentially no choice, and they're still punished for eternity. And I think this is another clear demonstration that whatever you think good and bad means, whatever you think those words mean, Matt, and I think we don't have the same meaning. On my worldview, right, in terms of well-being, your worldview is not just, it does not promote well-being, and again, my worldview is proper and superior in terms of morality. Mike is yours.
This is not on topic. Calvinism is not on trial here. I can defend it very well from the Bible and logic. I don't want to get too far into it. And Rapture Ready always does this. He always causes problems and stops the preaching of the gospel one way or another and stuff like this. He doesn't have all his paws in a litter box, folks. No, Calvinism does not undermine morality or free will. You don't understand either one as it relates to it. And you call it an infinite evil rule. You don't have infinite evil in your worldview. You keep refuting yourself, DS, by assuming certain things that are not within your worldview, and then you argue from that perspective. And so you're self-refuting in that. And I find that to be inconsistent. And as far as an infinite crime goes, look, if I would not do this, but DS, if I were to slap you upside the head, we're face to face, I slap you, you might back up and say, what was that for? You might take a swing back at me, whatever. If I were to do the same thing to the president, the exact same action gets a different result. It's a finite action, but it gets different results based on who it's against. You go up the chain of command to the infinite God, you insult him, there's an infinite consequence. The logic is sound. Now, I've got arguments for these kind of things, but this is not a defense of the Calvinism. If you guys want me to do a dissertation on Calvinism, I'd be glad to. But the debate is atheism the proper worldview to hold? That's what the debate topic is, not Calvinism. Come on, let's stick on topic. Go ahead.
All right, on morality, Matt, you solved the Euthyphro's dilemma by grounding morality into the nature of God and pointing out that God's immutable, so his nature is not going to change, therefore the morality isn't going to change. But, even in the face of his immutability, it still seems that morality is subjective. God is the subject of his own moral views. If people can have different moral views, then it relegates God's morality as also being subjective. Now, I don't see any intrinsic imperative for behaviors that God calls righteousness. Instead, what I do see is God calls certain things righteous and unrighteous, and then there's an appeal to a consequence. For example, if you don't walk in righteousness, which includes being regenerated and everything, then you're going to be thrown in hell. But there's no intrinsic imperative. There's an appeal to consequence. Also, so it seems just like in this universe, the things that are closest able to present themselves as an objective morality are the things that are able to be enforced by a really powerful being. But what if you have an immutable Platonic form that an atheist would appeal to? You know, how does that compare with an immutable nature of God as far as an objective moral source? Okay.
Now you don't want to take the question?
That's 3 times in a row. I need 2 more seconds than what you give me, because I'm actually writing things out and have to finish my thoughts so that I can hopefully respond accurately. Midnight. Honestly, I don't know if I properly understood your statement. How does an atheist? I don't know if I got that right. How does an atheist position compare to the objective moral God as an objective moral source? Seriously, I apologize. I'm trying to understand what you're saying, and I just don't think I'm getting it down, so I can't respond to it accurately. But you made a comment. If you want to write it out, that's fine. Type it out. I'd like to respond to it. But you said something, and my notes was no, not walking in righteousness. That's not the goal. Walking in righteousness is not the goal of Christianity. The goal of Christianity is to glorify God through the person of Jesus Christ. That's a whole different thing. And so what you're talking about is not a Christian perspective. Look, I'm assuming we're done with the debate, because now we're asking questions about Calvinism and the Christian perspective of this and that. We're not debating is atheism the proper the proper worldview to hold. I'm assuming we're so much off topic now that the debate's is basically gone because we're not responding to anything. I am honestly trying to stay on topic, which is why I'm not getting into the Calvinism thing. It's not the topic. So I'm not sure where to go from here. Pink Elephant, as an admin, come on, just, I would politely request get people to stay on topic, or just say, we're done. Let's just go into a bunch of questions about all kinds of stuff. That's okay. What do you think, DS? Think we're done with the topic at hand? We can just kind of whatever now. They can just ask whatever questions they want. Because then I don't mind answering questions about whatever, if that's okay with you. But I don't think I got what's his name's question right. So I apologize for that. Go ahead.
So to interrupt, I actually think that questions about competing worldviews are relevant. So you say, well, is atheism the proper worldview? Well, how does it compare to the other worldviews? Are the other worldviews better, or are they worse? So I think it's totally relevant. I mean, if we're asking questions about what do you think about Iranian nuclear policy, that's not relevant. But asking is a theistic worldview better than an atheistic worldview, I think is quite relevant. And if you don't want to take questions, Matt, I suggest you just pass, and I'll do the same, and I'll take questions if I think I should. Why don't we move on?
Yeah. Well, I think it's Radical Moderate's turn on the mic. Radical, do you want to maybe lower your mic a little bit and ask a really, really short and sweet question? Something that pertains to the debate topic in the room? Free mic. Go ahead, Radical Moderate. Your turn on the mic. Okay, well, Rapture ready. Do you want to go ahead and take the mic? Just ask your question. Just say whose question it will be. Just say which debater you're addressing, and stick to the topic. Free mic.
Yeah, I don't have a problem doing that, Pink. I'm sorry for getting too jumpy at the mic the last time, but I'll ask the question again. This question is pertinent to the topic. If your worldview, I'm asking Matt Slick, and he's still in the room. Matt Slick is still in the room, and he refused to answer the question the last time. If your worldview, Matt Slick, is one of a God who has already determined who's going to go to heaven and who's going to go to hell, please tell me how much different your worldview is differing from the atheist. The atheist who thinks that they have an excuse from your worldview. If your worldview of Reformed theology or Calvinism is dictating that God has already decided for people and they don't have to decide for themselves, please tell this room how much different your worldview is from the atheist who thinks they have an excuse before God. Matt Slick? Otherwise, you're not a formidable opponent. Maybe we need another opponent in this debate if you don't want to answer the question. Go ahead.
You always attack whatever I say and do. And the fact that you're in here, as usual, assisting the atheist is rather revelatory. If my worldview is one of God who determines who's going to heaven and hell, how's that different than atheism? Well, they don't have a God. They don't have heaven. They don't have hell. How's that different? Well, there's some differences right there. God in Christianity is sovereign. They don't have a God who's sovereign. Maybe you don't understand the difference between biblical theology and atheism. Perhaps you're not aware of the ontological differences between them. I don't know. Maybe you do. We could do a Bible study if you want, and I can inform you about basic Christian theology and the nature of God's existence, His omnipotence, His omnisapience, His omniscience, and His aseity and non-contingency, and that without Him nothing can exist. And you keep saying the God that I believe in. Well, you know what? Let me just turn the tables on you. The false idea that you have of God, a limited, semi-Pelagian kind of a being who doesn't know the future. You're probably an open theist, and you don't even know what you're doing. You couldn't even argue well. You don't know what you're doing half the time. You completely, regularly make mistakes in your attacks on Calvinism, demonstrating you don't understand what it is, misrepresenting it, and when I and others get back on the mic to try and correct you, you go back like a dog to his own vomit, returning to the error. You know what? I don't have much place for you in my life, except to use you as an example of what not to do. You are a great example of that, of bad logic, bad thinking. If you don't know the difference between Christianity and atheism, you're really bad. And if you don't understand the difference between God's sovereignty biblically, which is what Calvinism reflects, as it says in Isaiah 1:11, God works all things after the counsel of His will. And read Romans 9:22 and 23, which clearly says God makes all things after what He desires, some for honorable use and some for dishonorable use. And you can argue all you want against the Word of God. In your incredible foolishness, Rapture Ready, you continue to show yourself to play the fool. Now, you deserve that. Go ahead. Next.
Okay, so I'm just going to cut you off, Midnight. Thanks, Pink. Thanks, Matt. So just to reiterate, I do think Calvinism is relevant because not only are we dealing with a worldview that punishes the innocent for the crimes of the guilty, that punishes the innocent descendants for ongoing infinite amount of time, and then forgives those people through blood sacrifice and scapegoating, and thus abolishes the notion of ethical responsibility on which all ethics is based. We also have a worldview where people's infinite punishment based on finite sin, which is itself infinitely unjust and infinitely evil, is based on something that is predetermined. So not only is it infinitely evil, but it's rigged. So, I think this clearly demonstrates that this is unethical in just about every dimension we can imagine. And therefore, if this is a moral framework, I don't think I've heard a less moral framework than the one that Matt is offering. And I'm sure you're a nice guy, Matt, but I think I could have a cruel ethical system, not even a nice humanistic one, and I think mine would still be much more moral and thus much more proper. Thanks. I guess, who's up next? Someone was on mic that we cut off. Was it Midnight or Radical? Midnight? And yeah, Matt, you'll do 3-minute closing arguments after the last questioner. That would be great. All right, make the stream.
All right, so this is the last question, and this is a very easy question. Matt Slick, you mentioned that you would like to see beforehand the illustrations that would go along with my proofs, and as a formal proof, there would, of course, be illustrations. I can very easily conjure up some illustrations and post them on a site to which I can provide everyone in the room a link, and we can follow along. I will give them to you beforehand so you can familiarize yourself with them if you would like. I have no problem doing that because I'm that confident in the argument. So, would you be willing to do that? Because I would very much like this to be in a public forum, because it's obvious that you've put so much time and effort into your transcendental argument for the existence of God, and I have, I believe, found a refutation. So I really want to know how you would handle it, Mike Free. And thanks.
Yeah, I'm curious. What would you do, Matt, if
Wait a second. I thought it was Matt's turn and then DSchiff's. I'm sorry, Dionysian, but we are having like a debate, formal debate in here. So it's Matt Slick's turn if he wants to respond, and then DSchiff can respond. I'll remove the dot.
There's supposed to be a question about the debate, and he's asking about something about tag. That's a different thing altogether. So, really, seriously, I'm having difficulty following all of this. I'm very focused. We're debating a particular issue, and tag isn't the issue. Tag is an issue in itself. I thought you were going to just email me the information. I could take a look at it, because I said before, if you just speak it, I'm going to be able to understand your argument very well by writing it down. I can then cross-examine what it is you say. If, however, your examples, the only thing I'm concerned about are highfalutin, sophisticated logic symbols and stuff, I just don't know all that stuff. So it wouldn't really do much good. But anyway, I was hoping that you would just give me, something in email, and we could take a look at it. So this is so off topic. Is atheism the right worldview to hold? Tag is a different topic altogether. So seriously, I'm at a loss at this point. And by the way, folks, I'm not going to respond to Rapture Ready. He's, let's just say, I won't say it, but I'm just not going to respond to him. Not because I can't. I've refuted him so many times. He's just overly obstreperous. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think there was necessarily a component of that I had to answer. I would have liked to hear an answer, though, Matt. I'm a little disappointed. I do think it's topical enough that you should have provided one. I guess we'll leave that to Rapture. And if you don't want to respond to him, then you shouldn't then respond when I respond, Matt. Right? Mic is yours, Rapture.
I just want to thank Pink. First of all, Pink, you're excellent. You're an excellent, non-biased moderator. I love that. Thank you, first of all, for Pink. Second of all, I'm going to ask you the question again because it's pertinent to this argument, Matt Slick. It's pertinent because it is your worldview. Your worldview is a worldview that states and tries to demonstrate, I guess, that the God that you believe in has already predetermined everything. All right? Okay? Your God has already predetermined everything. That is your worldview, Matt Slick. You can't just count on the other person like DS to expose his worldview, we disagree with, and I could actually have a debate with. But you have to actually expose your own worldview. And your own worldview in a God that has predetermined everything has more in common with DS than you will ever have with Christianity. How do you explain that, Matt Slick? That's my question. And you're not going to answer it, and you're going to ignore me, and you've been pinned to the floor many times before this, because I'll continue to bring this subject up until you actually, I don't know, what? Admit that you're not a Christian? I don't know. I don't know how you're going to end this, except to ignore me. Go ahead, Midnight. Or if anybody wants to, if DS wants to make any comments about that. Matt Slick, you want to comment on that? It's your worldview, dude. You've admitted it over and over and over. This is your worldview. Why? Tell us, explain to us the difference between your worldview and the atheist worldview. Go ahead. I don't think there's any difference myself.
Sorry, but I think Matt Slick has already explained it the last time. Rapture Ready. I think he has already said there are several points of difference between his worldview and the atheistic worldview. But does DSchiff want to take the mic and answer Rapture Ready? Open mic.
No, that's fine. I think I've already explained why I do agree that Calvinism is yet another example of how Matt's moral view is not just infinitely unjust, but also rigged, and thus my worldview is proper and morally superior. So we should move on to the next person.
All right, last question I have on morality. Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that God is the moral source. God's nature is the moral source because His nature is immutable. How does that stack up to someone appealing to an immutable Platonic form of morality? Does God as a moral source retain its objectivity, or is it subjective in the face of an immutable Platonic form? All right.
What I try and do is type out the questions that people are asking them so that I can see the question, so that I can respond to the question. And the difficulty arises when people ask questions that are multifaceted, and it makes it difficult for me to get the question down properly. And this is such a case. And you were saying something to the effect of, how is my worldview, which is off topic, but how is my worldview different than the Platonic forms? Is that what your question is? Roughly. That's a question, roughly? Platonic forms presupposes transcendentals and a uniformity of conceptual abstractions that are basically, the philosophical term is entities. Well, okay, the Christian worldview posits that all such things must necessarily be the result of the universal immutable mind of God, who's a necessary preconditions for all intelligibility and moral absolutes. So the difference is that the Christian God is personal, the Platonic forms are not. The Platonic forms are, from what I understand, are simply self-evident, intuitive actualities that are actually conceptual manifestations, but I don't see any universal mind in a Platonic form. When the Christian worldview, we do have a universal mind, a transcendental one. So I see differences there. I'm hoping that I'm representing your question properly. And boy, here we go. Just nothing but attacks from the atheists and Rapture. Anyway, I hope I answered that sufficiently. Okay? I hope I did. If I understood it properly, go ahead.
Great, thank you. So, yeah, I think it's interesting because I think in an immutable, Platonic, supervening moral framework would be just as good, or really just as bad, as a moral framework that supervenes on a invisible mind or a God. You can make a system of metaphysics and say, well, here are the rules. The rules are there's one bucket of things you should do and one bucket of things you shouldn't do. And the things with the check mark, we're going to call that good. And those things are the things that you obey God for. And the other things are things that you're not obeying God. I don't think that this is meaningful, the divine check mark. And we can just as easily have a Platonic moral framework where there happen to be these moral laws that supervene and they're not created by some sort of entity. But again, neither of these I think are especially useful because when we really want to know why is murder bad, why is theft bad, why is rape bad, if we're going to have meaningful answers, we're going to appeal to naturalistic explanations. And thus we can see that supernaturalism and supernatural check marks really have no stake here. So that's my response. So were we going to cut off the Q&A at some point, Matt, and do our closings? I thought we were going to end after radical. You're done when I am? I mean, I can keep going. You want to stop Q&A now? I'm open. I guess we're both open. Our ambivalence cancels. So I don't know. Why don't everyone else who has a question put their hands up? Or we could stop. I'll leave that to you guys. Make us free.
Well, I don't really have a question. Just wanted to respond to Rapture. Yeah, Matt Slick was right about you. You don't have all paws in the cat box. If you got to ask, how is Calvinism different than atheism? First of all, atheists don't believe in a God. Calvinists do. Secondly, atheists don't believe in salvation. Calvinists do. So, yeah, you're not too bright. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Let them do closings, but I will say this, Matt, your worldview is of a God who's already predetermined everything. What difference does it make? Why in the world would you even be here arguing? What difference does any of these other plateaus mean? What does it mean? What does these other philosophies? None of the philosophies mean anything when you believe that God has already determined everything. Matt, that's your worldview. Your worldview states that, Matt. That's your worldview. Anyway, closing statements, and I'll make some closing ones too. Anyway, next up.
Okay then. I guess my question would be towards DS. And the question would be, if I think you're an ethical subjectivist, so you're sort of like a relativist. So I don't have a problem with people, believing that morality is subjective or something like that. But it seems like if two people had a difference of opinion about a moral dilemma, isn't moral subjectivism in some way saying that you can both be right? Like, two people can have opposing opinions about the same moral dilemma, and they're both in some sense true. Like ISIS believes it's okay to chop people's heads off. We say it's not okay. And so aren't you both saying that it is both true and false, that it's both okay to chop people's heads off, and it's not okay to chop people's heads off, depending upon who is saying it? It's kind of like, it seems like you're inevitably going to run into contradictions like that or something like that. And it just seems odd if somebody says that they're a constructivist about morality. That doesn't seem to be a subjective stance or something like that. But anyway, so how can you ground morality on subjective notions when people just have differences of agreement? It would seem that you would need something else other than just somebody's subjective opinion to ground your morality, or else people just do pretty much whatever they wanted to, I guess, freely.
Thanks for the question, Bigfoot. I guess you're joining us a little bit late tonight. We've talked about some of this. So first, I would say, yeah, there's absolutely disagreement on naturalism. There are atheists who have all sorts of different ethical systems. There's absolutely moral disagreement. One thing I think is that there's too much importance attached to what I'm going to call the official check mark or the supernatural check mark. It's officially approved. I think humans psychologically essentialize things. We call this psychological essentialism. We attach sort of supernatural or superstitious characteristics. So ethics, it feels so powerful, it has to have a supernatural check mark attached to it. I don't think that's really relevant. I think we really want to refer to reasons. We say, well, why is torture bad? Is it because there's a supernatural check mark, or let's talk about it hurts people, it deprives them of a valuable life. We can appeal to these real reasons, and this really settles the disagreement. So I can say, hey, I don't want to hurt children, and a Nazi comes along and says, I want to torture children, and we both think we're right. What are we going to do? We both think that we have the right opinion. There's disagreement. Well, what we do is we fight. That's what we do. If they want to torture children, they want to torture children, and I try to stop them. And this is how the world works. So notice, in addition to disagreement existing in naturalism, disagreement exists under supernaturalism. Religion has the most disagreement. Religious moral disagreement has led to, massive sexism, slavery. You have denominations, all the major denominations of today are having internal debates about gay marriage. They can't even agree within denominations, much less within religions, much less across religions. And they've slaughtered each other and argued and fought and oppressed each other over disagreements since religion has been around. So there's going to be disagreement under either account. The question is, do you want to disagree about God says X or God says Y, or do you want to disagree about here is natural reason X, which is actually spelled out, not just a divine checkmark, versus here's natural reason Y. And I think that appealing to naturalism is going to actually give you something to discuss. And it won't be based on Iron Age ethics. Mike is free.
Yeah, Matt, if you want to take the mic, it's your turn.
I need to say this, that several times, DS, you've misrepresented the Christian perspective, and because of the nature of the discussion, I've not been allowed to go in and make those corrections, and you've built upon various errors and presented them. I mean this respectfully, but you don't understand Christian theology in some significant areas, and it demonstrates that itself in some of the comments that you're making. And I don't mean it disrespectfully. I just mean that you don't understand some of the issues of Christian theology, and you should if you're going to argue them. But it's not. This issue is not about Christians arguing with Christians. They certainly do. It doesn't invalidate Christianity any more than atheists arguing with atheists invalidates atheism. It's not about individuals and their personal problems. It's about the worldview of atheism and its validity. And that's what the debate topic is about. Now, I don't know about others, but because I try to stay on topic, even when I think it might make me not look as good as I possibly could by responding to another area, because of what I consider to be a certain level of integrity, I want to stay on topic as much as possible, because that's what I've agreed to do. And, it's difficult to hear these things repeatedly, misrepresent my position or the Christian position, and then purport it as being the right view. Again, in closing statement, I'll try to raise some of these points, but the thing is that it's not about the Christian worldview versus a Christian worldview, a Christian versus a Christian, anymore than it's about Rapture Ready and I arguing. This is not germane to the topic of the validity of atheism. The question is whether or not atheism is a right view to hold. Does it properly represent actuality? And that's something that we've not seen demonstrated yet. And I'm not going to get into my closing statement now, but I just have a problem with that. And if you guys want to know what Christian theology teaches sometime, DS, for real, I mean this, and I mean this all seriousness. If you want to know some of the deeper levels of what Christian theology teaches, I'd be glad to help you out. And know that I don't mean it in any condescending way whatsoever, but so that you would better understand our position. Because sometimes people will say God predestines everything means He's also causing it, but that's not the Christian position. Ordination is different than predestination. And there's certain issues that are logically necessary within God's omnipotence and omnipresence and omniscience. And we can get into these things. And I teach on these things to Christians. A lot of them don't have any idea what we're talking about initially and then appreciate the knowledge afterwards. If you want to do that sometime, I'd be glad to help you. Again, no condescension meant in all seriousness. Just if you'd like, I'd love to teach you what we actually teach. Hope that came out okay. Go ahead.
Nightmare, do you have a question for any specific debater?
Well, I wasn't sure if I'm able to just grab the mic and make the, ask the question. Is that okay, Elephant? I'll be real quick. I just typed it out. I'll paste it in the room if you want as well. Here's what I wanted to ask, because as a theist, I struggle with this question. So let me just lay it out. The question is, if using via negativo language that is describing something by what it is not renders a definition of God meaningless, for instance, in the position of agnosticism, IGNOSTICISM, how is the definition of atheism as unbelief any different? Like for example, could you both, Matt and DS, give me a definition of belief that is encompassing of your worldview that is not negative definitions only? I think you both understand this question.
Great. I'm thinking I should take this one first because it was more directly addressed to me. So I think, as you pointed out, terms like immaterial, what does that mean? It's not material. Supernatural, it's not natural. Even things like transcendent and divine, I don't think they have a particular concrete meaning. So these words are defined by negation. It's what is not material. I have no idea what that is. I can come up with all sorts of categories. It's not temporal. It's atemporal. And I can come up with extra phrases like, oh, it's not. There's natural. There's supernatural. There's ultranatural. There's ubernatural. And when people use these words a lot, then they think that they mean things. I don't think that they do. I think that it's a mistake of language we use. We have, I see the word temporal, so if I say uber temporal, that must mean something too. And I don't think it works that way. So you see why this is problematic. Now, why is atheism not problematic in the same way? Well, with atheism, I'm not making a positive ontological claim. I'm not claiming that something exists and saying, well, atheism is a belief in man-bear-pig, and man-bear-pig is ubernatural and, quasi-temporal. So I'm not offering a positive ontological claim and then attaching to it similar characteristics, which are then, again, defined by negation. I simply lack belief in gods. So atheism, as mentioned at the very beginning of this debate, is not the umbrella worldview. It's not central to my worldview at all. It's central to my worldview in the same way that my lack of belief in, and this is not intended to be insulting, right? My lack of belief in angels or fairies is not central. It's just a side point. So I do have positive belief claims. I believe in things like biology and chemistry and cosmology. So these are essentially positive claims, and none of these claims really rest on things that are defined by negation. So that's a really stark difference between my worldview and my claims, of which atheism is not a claim per se, and the theistic and supernatural claims, which are based on these really undefined characteristics. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, I've actually thought about that question before, and I thought I wrote about it on CarNet. I was thinking about it, but I can't find it. So I always thought it was interesting that atheists would define themselves by what they are not, in that sense, where Christians define themselves by what they are. Atheists define themselves by what they don't believe in. I'm not saying it's all they define themselves in, but they lack belief in God. Where we say, no, we affirm belief in God. Lack is just another form of denial. And the reason I know this is because we behave based on what we believe, not what we don't believe in. So if I were to say to DS, if I were to say God exists, so therefore I win, he would logically get in and say, well, you can't say that because, and the reason he'd be doing that because he has certain beliefs that he would raise in an objection. So we reveal our beliefs by our behaviors. When, in my opinion, this is my opinion, okay, when an atheist argues against God's existence. What he's doing is believing that God does not exist, because I do not know of any instance where anybody would argue a position based on what they don't believe in, but they would argue based on what they do believe in. I'm not talking about joking at a party and some stupid board game, things like that. So and I've written about that on CARM, and it's worth a good discussion. DS, perhaps you and I could do that in private sometime and talk about this, because I think I could work out some interesting questions and some dialogues, not to attack, because it's actually something I'm actually interested in. Go ahead.
I guess it's me. Matt said he wanted the question pasted in text. Oh, it's so sad. Oh, apparently Matt can hear me. That's the only person that needs to hear me. So, yeah, I'm going to paste the question in text. That'll make just things a little bit easier.
Okay, I guess we're waiting for this question in text. Hopefully it'll... Oh, there it is. I'll read it out loud and then you can answer, Matt. I guess it's addressed to you. Is God's nature the foundation of moral values? If so, are there specific aspects of God's nature that ground moral values? What are these? Can these aspects of God's nature be instantiated by non-God things, regardless of whether or not God exists? E.g., being loving, in quotes, being an aspect of God's nature that can be instantiated by humans, even if God does not exist. If they can be, then would that mean moral values can be grounded even if God does not exist, as per positive atheism?
All right, let's see if I can deal with this. I copied it down. Anarcho, who said that God created viruses? Okay, is God's nature the foundation of moral values? I would say yes, that what true morality is a reflection and revelation of God's character. It's impossible for God to lie, Titus 1:2, so therefore God cannot lie. And so it will be reflection. If so, are there specific aspects of God's nature that ground moral values? Well, this problem I can't solve, or that question I can't answer. Are there specific aspects of his nature? You're talking about the nature and essence of that being, which is wholly and completely other than what I am. And I'm not trying to get out from this. It's just, I've thought of this before, had dialogues on this kind of before, this issue. When we talk about the very nature and essence of God and accounting for aspects within his nature, you're asking me for something I don't have privilege knowledge of, and I don't have the ability to answer. So it's like saying, what are these aspects of God's nature? The only other way I could think of even approaching the question would be to talk about attributes of God's nature, such as holiness, integrity, truthfulness, and things like that. Those would be moral attributes. That's as close, I think, if I'm understanding your question properly, that's as close as I can get to it. Can these aspects of God's nature be instantiated by non-God things? No, they can't. Because holiness, for example, is a quality of being, not as in a rock has being, but as the deity has being and is being, his nature and essence. In Christian theology, he says in 1 Peter 1:16, be holy, for I am holy. So we have an attribute of God's character, just basically what it is. And he says to be it. It's not an ontological be, it's a command following be, and I can get into that, but at any rate. So non-God things can't share in that. Now, when I say that, I have to be careful because we have in Christian theology what's called the communicable attributes and non-communicable attributes of God. It's a tangent. We could talk about that, but I won't get into that. Being loving, being an aspect of God's nature that can be instantiated by humans. That's called the communicable attributes of God, and that some of the attributes that God has can be communicated to us, where he displays them perfectly, we display them imperfectly. So we can say they can be communicated to us. They're called the communicable attributes of God. Anyway, even if God does not exist, no, you can't have the communicable attributes of God if God doesn't have existence. If they can't. So the rest of it doesn't make sense because it's based on a faulty premise. If I'm understanding, I'm trying to go through quickly. Whew. Okay, go ahead.
So thanks, Matt. So, I would say, and this gets to the modified use of Fred's dilemma, if you're going to say it's a false dichotomy and try to combine the two and avoid the two horns, and say, God is equivalent to goodness, he's equivalent to his moral properties, you trigger the aseity transcendence dilemma, which is similar. So, to make any sense of the claim that God is good, the traits that are constitutive of goodness, such as being compassionate or loving or whatever it is, they're either good prior to God, that they logically precede God, in which case they're independent of God, and God is good because he has the characteristic of being loving. If that's true, then humans can also have this characteristic independent of God, and then Noctambulan's question would apply. On the other hand, if these characteristics are only good because God has them, then I think you have arbitrariness again, and you have no reason to think, why would being a God make these traits good? So I do think this lands you in a trap. It looks like we don't have... I think we should probably move on to the closings. Looks like the questions are going down, and we are bidding on about 3 hours. So if you like, Matt, I propose that we do 3-minute closings, and since I started the opening, I believe you will start the closing, and we'll be able to wrap this up. Great. Mic is yours, Matt.
3 minutes, of course, is not nearly enough to say what I want to say, but nevertheless, that's what we agreed to. You have repeatedly declared moral superiority without demonstrating moral superiority. You have not surpassed the problem of you imposing your subjective opinion based on your preferences, your subjective preferences, and therefore such opinions obligate others for certain moral behavior. What you have done, you've contradicted yourself by appealing inadvertently to universal moral truths. You have stated that certain actions are in and of themselves morally wrong, but you've not been able to establish why they're morally wrong. If you were to appeal to society as a conventional means of determining it, society's change, morals change, and who are you to judge another society? To say that we're modifying and growing now is simply to beg the question, and to say that what is new is better than what's old, but that's just not provable in that context. You've appealed to various things that have ontological moral impropriety, and that others ought to recognize such a condition. But to do that is to forfeit the very debate that we're having, because atheism does not allow for transcendental truths. You have to argue against your own position in order to argue against mine, but to do that refutes your own and supports mine. The very fact that you would argue against my position by using any form of universal moral truth means that you forfeited your position. You're saying, Matt, you have a universal moral truth system. I'm going to appeal to it in order to argue against you, even though I can't have one. What you're talking about is saying there is a transcendental system, a transcendental something out there, that it is naturally wrong for X, Y, Z to occur, and you appeal, but you don't establish why it is or why it is not. You appeal to the universality of it. You can't have such universalities in your atheistic, materialistic, naturalistic worldview. You've not also addressed sufficiently the answer of how the human brain can produce proper logical inference, since it's a chemical reaction machine. How is one chemical state leading to another chemical state producing proper logical inference by which you can then know that your judgments are correct and true? You've not been able to surmount either one of these questions. One is the naturalistic problem restriction area, dealing with the physical brain and it producing proper logical inference. The other one is that you are actually appealing to universal transcendental moral truths in order to argue against my position, which refutes your own. So, in my opinion, and you'll disagree, of course, you'll say that you have answered, but I'll say no, you haven't, is that you have refuted yourself in the argument in two main areas. One, you've appealed to universal transcendentals, which can exist. You've not been able to demonstrate why your naturalism can produce proper logical inference. That is a problem. Is my time up yet? Is that it? I think it is. I'm not done anyway. No? Not? Oh, I thought you could do the timing thing. That's okay. But let me just reiterate this. 40 seconds, thank you very much. Let me just do this slowly. In fact, I'll pace this in, so it will give you a chance to hopefully respond to this specifically. This is important. By By you appealing to the universality of moral right and wrong, you are appealing to transcendentals, universal moral truth values, which refutes your naturalism because you cannot have universal transcendental moral truths in a universe of nothing more than physics, chemical reactions, homo sapiens, etc. You are self-refuting. If you don't address that and get out of it, then you're still self-refuting. Go ahead.
Wonderful. I appreciated that closing, Matt. So from the outset, I demonstrated that you have the burden because your ontology is larger, your ontology is more complex, and your ontology introduces new classes of items. I argued that you did not meet your burden in any sense. You didn't really offer any evidential arguments or any logical arguments, and I was happy to refute any rational arguments you would have provided. Also, we can tell that atheism is a better worldview because it has stronger evidential methods. Falsifiability, we test our claims, we use reason, we use evidence in general. We don't use faith or authority or tradition or dubious miracle claims. Again, your methods can also be used to support Hinduism and Zoroastrianism and Balto-Slavic religion and Chinese folk religion and Native American religion. So when you use methods that produce competing, opposing, mutually exclusive results, they're not reliable methods. And this is how we can tell that my atheistic worldview, humanism, evidentialism, and so on, is superior evidentially and epistemologically. In terms of moral wrongness, I think it also shined here that my worldview is superior in this sense. So first I gave a definition of moral wrongness based on manifest experience of suffering and how this is plausibly what is bad. And then I've taken my applied ethics based on this definition. I've also explained why naturalistic explanations themselves are meaningful. So is torturing a child bad because it harms them, it deprives them of a valuable life, or because God says so? And we can all tell that God says so doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any explanatory power. So supernaturalistic explanations really have no role, they have no stake. And I don't need to appeal to supernaturalism. I just have to appeal to things that people really understand and really care about. So it's not because of the divine checkmark, which is what's really important to you, that there's an official rule, that he's the boss, he makes the rules, is really about obedience. And one result, apart from that not having explanatory power or being morally robust, is that one loses moral agency and one is willing to support genocide, torture, the murder of the children of slave girls in Egypt, the punishment of the innocent for the crimes of the guilty, infinite torture for finite sins, for things that aren't even immoral, in hell, of course. So we can see how the meta-ethical and normative ethical systems of religion produce all these really bad practical results. And this really demonstrates that atheism is the proper worldview and the superior worldview. So I think I've really made the case that my worldview is much stronger in terms of both its evidential epistemological bases, that the burden of proof has not been met by your side, and that really morally it shines meta-ethically, normatively, and in terms of practical ethics. I really think I've made that case today. And finally, I want to thank everyone for coming to listen. I really appreciate all of your input and discussion. I want to thank Matt for this. I think we have moved a lot since the debate challenge. And clearly this was a good debate, Matt, because we went from a 1-hour planned debate to about a 3-hour debate. That's pretty exciting. And then finally, I want to thank a pink elephant who has stuck around for 3 hours, with us and was a wonderful moderator, very objective. So appreciate everyone, and with that, we'll close the debate. Have a good night.